She was dragged onto the auction platform like an animal, hands bound, mouth bleeding, and the whole town watched as if it were Sunday afternoon entertainment. But when the most fearsome bounty hunter on the frontier emerged from the dust and placed a price that silenced everyone, no one suspected it was the beginning of the downfall of an entire empire. If you want to know how the girl sold into slavery overthrew the most powerful men on the frontier, follow the story to the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far the story has progressed. Hint. The rope cut into her wrist so deep she'd stopped feeling her fingers about an hour ago. Elena Cross stood at the edge of the wooden platform they'd built in the center of Coulter's Bend, the same platform where they auctioned cattle every third Saturday, and she stared out at the crowd gathering in the afternoon heat and thought about how none of them would look her in the eye. Not one. They looked at her boots. They looked at the torn collar of her shirt. They looked at the bruise spreading across her left cheekbone where Harlan Briggs had backhanded her that morning when she'd spit in his face. But not one of them. Not the shopkeeper's wife clutching her parasol. Not the old men leaning against the feed store railing. Not the ranch hands who'd ridden in from the flatlands just to watch. Would meet her gaze. She'd grown up with some of these people. She'd bought flour from the general store. She'd helped Mrs. Calloway birth a calf 2 springs ago when the veterinarian was drunk in the saloon. She'd lent her father's plow to the Dawson family when theirs broke, and they'd never returned it, and she'd never asked for it back because that wasn't how neighbors acted. Now they were here to watch her get sold. The auctioneer was a man named Pudge Wiley, and he had a voice like a rusted gate and teeth the color of wet tobacco. He climbed the platform steps wheezing, wiped his forehead with a handkerchief that had once been white, and tested the wooden railing with his palm like he was checking a horse stall. "Gentlemen," Pudge said, turning to the crowd with a grin that made Elena's stomach turn. "And I use that term real loose. We got ourselves a special lot this afternoon." Laughter. Scattered, ugly laughter from men who had dust on their hats and whiskey on their breath before noon. Elena pulled against the rope and felt the skin on her wrist tear a little more. She didn't flinch. She'd decided that morning, sitting in the back of Harlan's wagon with her ankles chained to the floorboard, that she would not give them the satisfaction. "Miss Elena Cross," Pudge continued, reading from a card he'd been given, 23 years of age, healthy, strong, good teeth. He said it the same way he'd describe a mule. Former owner of the Cross homestead, 160 acres, water rights to Blackbird Creek, property now held in lien by the Coulter's Bend Cattlemen's Association. "That's a lie," Elena said. Pudge didn't even look at her. "As I was saying, that's a lie, and every person standing in this square knows it." Her voice was steady, louder than she expected. "My father filed that claim 14 years ago. He built that house with his own hands. He dug that well himself. There is no lien because there is no debt." Pudge turned to her with a look that was half annoyance, half amusement. "Sweetheart, the paperwork says different. The paperwork is forged." A ripple went through the crowd. Not of shock, they all knew. It was the ripple of discomfort that comes when someone says out loud what everyone has agreed to pretend isn't true. From the front row, Harlan Briggs shifted his weight and crossed his arms. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a neatly trimmed beard and clean clothes that set him apart from the working men around him. He owned more land than anyone in the territory, and he'd gotten most of it the same way he was getting hers, through paperwork that appeared from nowhere, and judges who owed him favors and sheriffs who found it easier to look the other way. "Get on with it, Pudge," Harlan called out. His voice was calm, almost bored. That was the thing about Harlan Briggs. He never raised his voice. He never had to. Elena looked directly at him. "You murdered my father." The square went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of agreement, but the held-breath quiet of people who desperately did not want to be involved. Harlan met her eyes for the first time. He smiled. It was a small smile, patient, the way you'd smile at a child throwing a tantrum. "Your father died in a riding accident, Miss Cross. The whole town mourned him. The whole town watched you take everything he built and did nothing." "Grief does terrible things to the mind," Harlan said, and he looked around at the crowd with practiced sympathy. "Real terrible things." Some of them nodded. That was the worst part. Some of them actually nodded. Pudge cleared his throat and adjusted his hat. "Right then, Bidding starts at $50 for a term of indenture, 5 years. Miss Cross will serve as domestic labor to the winning bidder. Terms are binding under Territorial Statute 14. There is no Territorial Statute 14, Elena said. I've read the Territorial Code. There hasn't been a legal indenture auction in this territory for 11 years. This is kidnapping. Pudge looked at her with genuine irritation now. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to be quiet.
Or what? You'll sell me twice?
A few people in the back of the crowd laughed at that. Quickly, nervously, the kind of laugh that dies the moment someone looks in your direction. Harlan Briggs leaned over to the man standing beside him, a wiry deputy named Cal Stoddard, who wore his badge like it was a decoration rather than a responsibility, and said something Elena couldn't hear. Cal nodded and moved toward the platform steps. Let's start the bidding, Pudge said quickly, sensing the mood shifting. $50. Do I hear 50? A hand went up near the back. Elena recognized the man, Deke Fontaine, who ran a saloon 2 towns over that everyone knew was more brothel than bar. He was grinning. 50 from Mr. Fontaine. Do I hear 60? 60. This from a rancher Elena didn't know, a heavy man with sunburned arms and a look on his face that made her skin crawl. 70. Deke again, not even hesitating. Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something beyond fear, something that lived on the other side of it. The understanding that this was actually happening, that she was standing on a platform in a town where she'd lived her entire life and men were bidding on her like she was livestock and no one was going to stop it. $80. 90. 100. The numbers climbed. Elena watched the crowd watching her, and she cataloged their faces. Mrs. Calloway, whose calf she'd helped deliver, was studying the ground. Tom Everly, who ran the dry goods store and had sold her father nails and lumber for 15 years, was pretending to examine his pocket watch. Judge Whitfield, who had signed the papers that supposedly transferred her family's land, was standing near the water trough with his hands in his pockets, looking vaguely bored. These were the people she'd thought of as her community. These were the people her father had trusted. 150, Deke Fontaine called out, and there was an edge to his voice now, competitive. He wanted to win. The heavy-set rancher shook his head and stepped back. A third bidder, someone Elena couldn't see clearly through the dust and the glare, raised the bid to 175. Pudge was sweating, enjoying himself. 175. Do I hear 200? Come on, gentlemen. This is prime. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Elena's voice cracked across the square like a whip. Pudge flinched, actually flinched, and for a moment the auctioneer's mask slipped, and she saw the small, ordinary coward underneath it. 200, Deke said. 225. A new voice, somewhere to the left. Elena tested the rope again. She'd been working at the knot behind her back for the last 10 minutes, using the rough edge of a nail head she'd found protruding from the platform railing. The rope was loosening, slowly, but not fast enough. She needed time. You know what's funny? Elena said, loudly enough for the whole square to hear. Not one of you will bid on a horse without checking its teeth first. But you'll buy a human being on the word of a man who can't spell his own name. She looked at Pudge. It's W-I-L-E-Y, not W-I-L-Y. I've seen your signature. A few more laughs. Pudge's face went red. 250, Deke shouted, irritated by the interruption. 300, the unseen bidder again. Deke swore and pushed forward through the crowd. Who the hell keeps... And then someone said the number that stopped everything. $5,000. The voice came from the edge of the square, where the road bent out of town toward the eastern mountains. It was quiet, unhurried, and it carried across the crowd the way thunder carries. Not because it was loud, but because everything else went silent to make room for it. Elena turned her head. He sat on a gray horse at the mouth of the street, and the dust that hung in the air behind him meant he'd been riding hard before he stopped. He was lean in the way that men get when they've spent years eating only when they remember to, and he wore a coat so covered in trail dust that its original color was anyone's guess. His hat was pulled low, shading his face, but Elena could see his jaw, the hard line of it, and the way his eyes moved across the crowd with the flat, disinterested efficiency of a man counting threats. He didn't dismount. He didn't even seem particularly interested in the proceedings. He said the number the way someone might comment on the weather. $5,000. Pudge's mouth was open. He closed it, opened it again. Sir, did you say... You heard what I said. Harlan Briggs had uncrossed his arms. For the first time since Elena had known him, his expression was something other than bored confidence. He was studying the rider with a careful, calculating stillness that reminded Elena of a rattlesnake deciding whether to strike. "And you are?" Harlan asked. The rider finally looked at him. Just looked at him. And something happened in that moment, a recognition that passed through the crowd like a cold wind. Elena saw it in the way people stepped back, the way hands moved toward holsters, the way the deputy Cal Stoddard suddenly found something very interesting to look at on his boots. Someone in the crowd whispered a name. Then someone else whispered it. Then it traveled through the square the way names do when they carry weight. Quick, urgent, afraid. Ronan Vale. Elena had heard the name. Everyone west of the divide had heard the name. Ronan Vale, the bounty hunter who'd brought in the Colby gang, all 7 of them, in a single week. Ronan Vale, who'd tracked a killer through 400 miles of desert and dragged him back alive when everyone, including the man's own mother, had assumed he was long dead. Ronan Vale, who they said had never lost a target, never failed a contract, and never explained himself to anyone. She'd always assumed half the stories were made up. Looking at him now, sitting on his dusty horse with $5,000 committed as casually as pocket change, she wasn't sure anymore. $5,000, Pudge repeated, and his voice had gone up about half an octave. That's the bid. 5,000. Do I hear... Does anyone... He looked at Deke Fontaine. Deke was staring at the rider. He shook his head slowly and took a step backward. 5,000 going once, Pudge said, and his eyes swept the crowd with something close to desperation. No one moved. Going twice. He swallowed hard. Sold to the gentleman on the gray horse. No one clapped. No one made a sound. The square had the feel of a room where someone has just drawn a weapon, that particular stillness where everyone is calculating the distance to the nearest door. Ronan Vale dismounted. He did it in one smooth motion, dropping the reins over the hitching post and walking toward the platform with steps that were neither fast nor slow. Elena noticed he wore his gun on his left hip, butt forward, which meant he was either left-handed or wanted people to think he was. His spurs didn't jingle. They'd been wrapped with leather strips to keep them silent. A man who wraps his spurs, Elena thought, is a man who doesn't want to be heard coming. He climbed the platform steps. Up close, he was older than she'd first guessed. Late 30s, maybe, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunrises and a scar across the bridge of his nose that had healed badly. His eyes were gray, or maybe green, and they settled on her with an expression she couldn't read. He reached behind her. She tensed, every muscle in her body coiling, ready to fight, ready to bite, ready to do whatever she had to do because she had not survived this long by being passive. He cut the rope. It fell away from her wrists in 2 pieces, and the blood rushed back into her fingers so fast it hurt worse than the binding had. Elena gasped, grabbed her own wrists, and stared at the man standing in front of her. Ronan Vale didn't say anything. He folded the knife, put it back in his coat, and turned toward the steps. "Wait," Elena said. He paused. "What are you doing?" He looked at her over his shoulder. "Leaving." "You just paid $5,000. "I'm aware." "For what?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Get on the horse or don't. That's your choice. But I'd make it fast because in about 2 minutes this crowd is going to remember they've got guns and opinions, and neither one of those things is going to work in your favor." Elena looked at the crowd. He was right. The shock was wearing off, and she could see the calculations starting. In Harlan's narrowed eyes, in Cal Stoddard's hand drifting toward his holster, in the way Deke Fontaine was whispering to 2 men who had the thick necks and empty faces of hired muscle. She looked back at Ronan Vale. She didn't trust him. She didn't know him. She didn't understand what he wanted or why he was here or what kind of man spends $5,000 to cut a stranger's ropes. But she understood the alternative. She walked down the platform steps on legs that were stiff from standing in the sun for 3 hours, and she climbed onto the gray horse. Ronan swung up behind her, gathered the reins, and turned the animal toward the eastern road. "Now hold on just a minute," Harlan Briggs called out. He'd stepped forward. and his voice had that careful, reasonable tone that Elena had learned to fear more than shouting. "Mr. Vale, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I know who you are," Ronan said without turning around. "Then you know this is my town, and that woman is on my horse, which makes her my concern, not yours. There are legal implications to sue me." He kicked the horse, and they were moving, not galloping. Ronan didn't seem like a man who galloped unless something was actively on fire, but moving with purpose, the gray horse's hooves kicking up dust as they rode east out of Coulter's Bend with the entire town watching and not a single person raising a hand to stop them. Elena didn't look back. She wanted to. She wanted to turn and see the faces of every person who'd stood in that square and done nothing, to burn their expressions into her memory so she'd never forget who they really were. But she didn't look back because she was afraid that if she did, she'd start crying. And she had made a promise to herself that she would not cry in front of anyone ever again. They rode in silence for 20 minutes before Elena's hands stopped shaking. 30 minutes before she trusted her voice. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Away from there." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got right now." She twisted in the saddle to look at him. His face was unreadable, his eyes on the horizon, scanning the terrain with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd spent years expecting to be followed. "You didn't buy me," Elena said. "I want that understood." "Understood? I'm not property. That auction was illegal. Whatever receipt Pudge Wiley wrote you isn't worth the paper." "I don't have a receipt." "What?" "I didn't pay him. I said a number. I didn't hand over any money." Elena stared at him. Are you serious?" "Do I look like I'm joking?" He did not look like he was joking. He looked like a man who had perhaps never told a joke in his life and would be deeply suspicious of anyone who tried to tell him one. "So you just said $5,000 in front of the whole town. In front of the whole town. And walked out. And walked out." Elena faced forward again and tried to process this information. Behind them, the dust of Coulter's Bend was fading into the afternoon haze, and ahead of them the road stretched into open grassland that rose gradually toward the dark line of the eastern mountains. "They'll come after us," she said. "After you. Harlan Briggs doesn't let people make him look foolish. I'm counting on it." That stopped her. "What?" Ronan pulled the horse to a walk as they crested a low rise. Below them, the grassland spread out in waves of brown and gold, cut by the thin silver line of a creek. He studied the landscape for a moment, then angled the horse toward a stand of cottonwoods near the water. "We'll stop here for a minute. Horse needs water." He dismounted first, then offered his hand to help her down. Elena ignored it and swung down on her own, landing harder than she'd intended and stumbling slightly on legs that had gone numb from the unfamiliar saddle. Ronan led the horse to the creek and let it drink. Elena stood a few feet away, rubbing her wrists where the rope burns had left raw, oozing lines in her skin. "So," she said, "you want to tell me what this is about?" "Not particularly." "Tough. You just rode into a town you've apparently never visited, bid a fortune you don't have on a woman you've never met, and rode out like it was a trip to the general store. I think I've earned an explanation." Ronan crouched by the creek and filled his canteen. He took a long drink, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked up at her. "You said something up on that platform. About your father's land. About the claim being forged." "It was forged. It is forged. My father filed on that land with the territorial office in Carson City 14 years ago. He has the original survey, the original filing receipt, everything. Had. He had everything before someone broke into our house and took it all." "Someone." "Harlan Briggs, or one of his men. Same thing." Ronan nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Your father, he did the original survey himself?" "He hired a surveyor out of Sacramento, a man named Hollister, Thomas Hollister. He came out, walked the whole property, drew the maps, filed the paperwork. Everything legal, everything proper. And those maps, the original survey maps, you know how to read them?" Elena frowned. "I grew up with them on the wall. My father taught me to read surveys before he taught me to read books." "Why?" Ronan stood up and looked east toward the mountains. His expression hadn't changed. It was still that flat, careful blankness. But something shifted in his posture. something that looked almost like relief. Because I've been looking for someone who can read Hollister's maps for 6 months, he said. And you're the first person I've found who didn't end up dead before I got to them. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. What do you mean, dead? Elena asked carefully. I mean exactly what it sounds like. 3 people in this territory knew how to read Thomas Hollister's original survey work. Ben Alcott, in Dryer's Gulch, found shot in his cabin 4 months ago. Margaret Sung, in Ridgewater, house burned down with her in it 2 months ago. And a clerk named David Park in the Carson City filing office, who went missing in January and hasn't been seen since. Elena's mouth had gone dry. And my father? Ronan looked at her. He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. Riding accident, Elena said bitterly. That's what they called it. I know what they called it. She sat down on a rock near the creek because her legs didn't feel reliable anymore. The cottonwood leaves rustled overhead, and the creek made a sound like someone whispering, and for a moment the world was very still and very wide, and Elena felt incredibly, terrifyingly alone. Why do you need someone to read those maps? She asked. Ronan sat down across from her, keeping the creek between them, which Elena noticed and appreciated. He was giving her space, letting her set the distance. There's a valley, he said, east of here, back in the mountains. Most people don't know it exists. It's not on any modern map, but it's on Hollister's original surveys. He mapped it in '58, before the cattlemen moved into this territory. Called it Wren Valley on the survey. About 3,000 acres of grassland, good water, timber on the slopes. Best land in the territory, and nobody's filed on it because nobody knows it's there. Nobody except you. Nobody except me, and a man named Price Calloway, who runs the Cattlemen's Association, and his partner Harlan Briggs. They've known about it for 2 years. They've been buying up every Hollister survey they can find, forging claims to every piece of land those surveys cover, and killing anyone who might be able to prove the forgeries. Elena stared at him. Price Calloway. She knew that name. He was Harlan's silent partner, a man who stayed in the background, who never came to town, who operated through lawyers and intermediaries. She'd heard her father mention him once, late at night, in a conversation with a neighbor that stopped abruptly when Elena walked into the room. That's why they took my father's land, she said. It wasn't a question. Your father's property borders the eastern access to Wren Valley. Anyone who controls that land controls the only practical route in. Briggs needed it. Your father wouldn't sell, so Briggs took it another way. And killed him. I can't prove that. But you believe it. I believe it. Elena looked at her hands. The rope burns were starting to scab over, dark lines crossing her wrists like someone had tried to write on her and given up. She flexed her fingers and felt the sting and let it remind her that she was alive, and that being alive meant she still had choices. What's in it for you? She asked. You're a bounty hunter. Someone's paying you. Ronan was quiet for a long time, long enough that Elena thought he might not answer. There was a family, he finally said. Settlers, husband and wife and 2 kids. They'd filed on a piece of land up near Ridgewater. Legal claim, proper paperwork, everything above board. Calloway wanted it. They wouldn't sell. So one night someone rode up and set fire to their barn, and when the husband ran out to save the horses, they shot him in the yard. He paused. His jaw tightened. The wife took the children and went east, back to Pennsylvania where her family was. She hired a lawyer to fight the claim in court. The lawyer took her money and disappeared. She wrote to the territorial governor. The letter was never delivered. She wrote to a newspaper in San Francisco. The editor wrote back and said he couldn't print accusations without proof. And? Elena pressed, because she could see where this was going, and she needed to hear him say it. And she hired me. Not to kill anyone, not to burn anything. She hired me to find proof, documentation, anything that would hold up in a real court, in front of a real judge, showing that Calloway and Briggs have been stealing land across this territory for years. How much is she paying you? She's not. She doesn't have any money. Her husband is dead, and her savings went to the lawyer who disappeared. Elena studied him. His face gave away almost nothing, but she'd grown up reading the faces of men who didn't like to show what they felt. Her father had been that way, quiet and closed and impossible to read unless you knew what to look for. And what she saw in Ronan Vale's face wasn't the flat calculation of a hired gun. It was something harder to name, something that looked like it hurt. "So you're doing this for free," she said. "I'm doing this because it needs doing." That's a terrible business model. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. She didn't think his face was capable of a full smile, but it was the closest she'd seen. "You're not wrong," he said. They sat by the creek while the shadows lengthened and the gray horse cropped grass along the bank. Elena's mind was working, fitting pieces together, connecting names and dates and events that she'd lived through without understanding their pattern. "The auction," she said. "That wasn't about selling me as labor, was it?" "No. It was about humiliation, about making an example. If they sell the cross girl in the public square, every other settler in the territory gets the message. Fight us, and we'll take everything, including your dignity." That's how I read it. "And you showed up because I've been watching Coulter's Bend for 3 weeks, waiting for an opportunity to make contact with you. The auction gave me one. A dramatic one, I'll admit, but beggars can't be choosers." Elena shook her head. "You could have just knocked on my door. Your door has been guarded by 2 of Briggs' men for the last month. They moved you out of your house 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to figure out how to get to you ever since." She hadn't known that. She'd been held in a storeroom behind Briggs' office for the last 3 weeks, and she'd assumed it was just spite, Briggs' way of breaking her down before the auction. She hadn't considered that it might also have been about keeping her away from someone. "So what now?" she asked. "You need me to read Hollister's maps. I assume you have them?" "I have copies, poor ones, transcribed from memory by a man who saw the originals before they were stolen, but they're enough to get us into Wren Valley, if someone who understands Hollister's notation can interpret the route. And once we're in the valley, then we find what Calloway is hiding, the original land records, the real surveys, the documentation that proves every claim he's filed in this territory is fraudulent. He's got a base of operations somewhere in that valley. I'm certain of it. A place where he keeps the records he doesn't want anyone to see. And then we bring that documentation to a federal judge, not a territorial one. Calloway owns every judge in the territory, a federal court in San Francisco, someone beyond his reach." Elena stood up and walked to the creek's edge. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones that caught the late afternoon light. She crouched down and washed the blood off her wrists, hissing through her teeth at the sting. "You know they'll come after us," she said, not looking at him. "Briggs, Calloway, their hired men, the deputies, everyone. The moment they figure out what we're doing, they'll send everything they have. I know. I can't fight. I can shoot, but I'm not a gunfighter. I'm not some frontier heroine from a dime novel. I'm a farmer's daughter who can read maps and keep books and deliver calves and fix a broken axle. That's what I am. That's exactly what I need." She turned to look at him. "And what are you? Really? Not the legend. Not the stories they tell in saloons. What are you actually?" Ronan was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. "I'm a man who's very good at finding people," he said, "and very bad at everything else." Elena almost laughed. She didn't, because the day had been too long and too awful for laughter, but she felt it somewhere in her chest, a flutter of something that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it. The acknowledgement that something absurd was happening, that she'd been auctioned off in a public square 4 hours ago and was now sitting by a creek discussing criminal conspiracies with a bounty hunter who admitted he'd bid $5,000 he didn't have. "All right," she said. "Show me the maps." Ronan reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather folder, worn smooth with handling. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, covered in dense, precise handwriting and geometric notations that Elena recognized immediately. Hollister's work. Even secondhand, even copied from memory, the distinctive style was unmistakable. The way he noted elevations, the symbols he used for water sources, the particular shorthand for geological formations that he'd developed himself and never shared with other surveyors. "This is wrong," Elena said, pointing to a notation on the first page. "What?" Whoever copied this didn't understand Hollister's bearing system. He used magnetic north, not true north, and he had a consistent 3-degree correction that he applied to all his territorial work. The declination was different out here than back east, and he adjusted for it. This copy doesn't account for that correction. Every bearing on this map is off by 3 degrees. Ronan stared at her. "You can tell that just by looking at it?" "My father and I spent 14 years reading Hollister's surveys. This particular notation, she tapped a symbol in the margin, means the bearing is from his Sacramento baseline, which requires the 3-degree correction. Without it, these directions would lead you into a box canyon about 6 miles south of where you want to be. That box canyon, Ronan said slowly. I've been there. I spent 3 days in it last month trying to figure out what I was missing. You were missing 3 degrees. He looked at her with what might have been admiration, though with Ronan it was hard to tell the difference between admiration and mild digestive discomfort. Can you correct them? The maps? I can do better than that. I can reconstruct the route from memory. My father had the original Hollister survey of the eastern ranges on the wall of his study for my entire childhood. I traced those maps for fun when I was 8 years old. I didn't know what they meant then, but I remember the lines. You're telling me you memorized a surveyor's map when you were 8. I'm telling you I traced it so many times the lines are burned into my brain. I can draw them in my sleep. I have drawn them in my sleep. My father caught me once, sleepwalking, sketching bearing lines on the kitchen wall with a piece of charcoal. Ronan was quiet for a moment, and then he did something Elena didn't expect. He laughed. It was short, rough, surprised out of him, and it changed his face completely. For one instant, he looked like a human being instead of a wanted poster. Your father, he said. He sounds like he was something. He was a stubborn, difficult, obsessive man who believed that if you had a legal right to something, the law would protect you. Elena's voice caught. She steadied it. He was wrong about that last part. Maybe he was. Maybe he just didn't live long enough to see it through. Elena folded the maps carefully and handed them back. We'll need supplies, food, water, ammunition, a second horse because this one will founder if it carries us both through mountain terrain. We'll need... I have a camp, Ronan said, about 4 miles from here, up in the rocks. Supplies, spare horse, everything we need for a week in the mountains. You planned this. I planned for the possibility of this. Planning and hoping aren't the same thing, but they're close cousins. Elena looked east toward the mountains that were turning purple in the fading light. Somewhere in those mountains was a valley that men were willing to kill for, and somewhere in that valley was the proof she needed. Not just to reclaim her father's land, but to expose the men who had taken it, who had taken everything, who had stood in a public square and sold a woman like livestock because they believed they could do anything and no one would stop them. She was under no illusions about what lay ahead. She was tired, hurt, half-starved, and running from the most powerful men in the territory with a companion she didn't know and had no reason to trust beyond the fact that he'd cut her ropes when he could have left them tied. But she could read maps that no one else alive could read, and that, for the moment, was enough. 4 miles, she said. Ronan nodded. Then we'd better get moving. Briggs will have riders out by sundown. He gathered the reins and swung into the saddle, then reached down. This time Elena took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. Elena, he said as they started east. What? That thing you said on the platform, about there being no territorial statute 14. What about it? Is that true? Of course it's true. Statute 14 covers livestock branding requirements. It has nothing to do with indenture. Pudge Wiley either made it up or someone told him to say it and he didn't bother to check. Huh. A pause. You read the territorial code for fun? I read it because my father made me. He said the only weapon that works in every situation is knowing what the law actually says. Smart man. Dead man, Elena said quietly. Smart and dead. They rode east as the sun dropped toward the horizon behind them, painting the grassland in shades of copper and rust. Elena kept her back straight and her eyes forward and her hands steady. And if Ronan noticed that her shoulders were shaking slightly in a way that had nothing to do with the motion of the horse, he had the decency not to mention it. Behind them, in Coulter's Bend, Harlan Briggs stood in the empty square where the auction platform was already being dismantled. He stared at the eastern road, at the dust that still hung in the air where Ronan Vale's horse had been, and his face was very calm and very still. Cal Stoddard approached from the sheriff's office, his badge catching the last of the sunlight. You want me to put a posse together? Harlan didn't answer immediately. He was thinking, which he did with a methodical patience that had served him well over the years. He'd built his empire not through recklessness, but through calculation, understanding the value of every move, every piece, every person on the board. Not a posse, he said finally. A posse is a bunch of drunks on horses making noise. I want something different. What kind of different? Harlan turned to look at him. Send word to Price. Tell him the cross girl got away. Tell him who took her. Cal's face went pale. Calloway's not going to like that. No, he's not. And when Calloway doesn't like something, I know what happens when Calloway doesn't like something, Cal. That's precisely why I want him informed. Harlan's voice was smooth, measured, a blade wrapped in silk. And tell him something else. Tell him she can read the maps. Cal stared at him. How do you know that? Because her father could read them, and he taught her everything he knew, and that's why she's still alive instead of buried next to him. I kept her alive because she was useful as leverage. Now she's useful to someone else, and that changes the math. He walked toward his office, his boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk, his shadow stretching long across the dirt street. One more thing, Cal. Yeah? Triple the guard on the Eastern Pass. I don't want anyone getting into those mountains who isn't on our payroll. And put the word out to every hired gun between here and the Nevada line. There's a $10,000 bounty on Ronan Vale. Alive. Cal swallowed. And the girl? Harlan paused in his doorway. He didn't turn around. The girl, he said, is worth more than all of us. Make sure everyone understands that. Whoever brings her back breathing. What happens after that is my concern. The door closed. Cal Stoddard stood alone in the empty square, listening to the evening wind and the distant sound of dogs barking and the particular quality of silence that settles over a town that has just done something unforgivable and is already beginning the long, quiet work of pretending it never happened. Orchestrated seamless narrative continuation with Vietnamese storytelling conventions. They reached Ronan's camp an hour after dark, picking their way up a narrow trail that switchbacked through granite boulders and scrub pine until it opened onto a shelf of flat rock hidden from below by an overhang that jutted out like a crooked jaw. A second horse, a sturdy bay mare with a white blaze on her forehead, was hobbled near a trickle of water that seeped from a crack in the rock face, and beside her were two canvas packs, a bedroll, and a fire pit that had been used recently but carefully buried with sand. Elena slid off the gray horse and felt every hour of the day crash into her at once. Her legs buckled slightly, and she caught herself on a boulder and stood there for a moment, breathing, letting the cold mountain air fill her lungs while her body tried to figure out whether it wanted to collapse or vomit, or both. There's jerky in the left pack, Ronan said, unsaddling the gray. Hardtack too, if your teeth are up to it. Water's in the canteen by the bedroll. How long have you had this camp? 3 weeks, since I started watching the town. Elena found the canteen and drank deeply, then tore into the jerky with a hunger that surprised her. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Briggs' men hadn't exactly prioritized her comfort during the 3 weeks she'd spent locked in the storeroom. Ronan worked in the dark with the practiced economy of a man who'd made and broken camp 1,000 times. He unsaddled both horses, checked their hooves by touch, and distributed feed from one of the canvas packs. He didn't light a fire. No fire tonight? Elena asked. Not until we're deeper in the mountains. Briggs will have riders on the eastern road by now. A fire up here would be visible for miles. So we sit in the dark. We sit in the dark. Elena leaned against the rock wall and chewed the jerky and listened to the sounds of the night. Wind in the pines, the horses shifting their weight, the distant yip of a coyote somewhere in the valley below. The stars were thick overhead, more than she'd ever seen from her father's porch, which didn't seem possible but was. Can I ask you something? She said. You've been asking me things all day. Don't see why you'd stop now. That family, the settlers in Ridgewater, the woman who hired you. Ronan was quiet. You said her husband was shot in the yard, that she took the kids back to Pennsylvania. That's what I said. You knew them, before, not just as a job. The silence stretched long enough that Elena thought she'd pushed too far. Then Ronan sat down against the opposite wall, about 10 feet away, and she heard him take a slow breath. The husband's name was James Farrow. He was the only person west of the Mississippi who'd ever beaten me at cards. Not once. 3 times. Same game, same table, same saloon in Ridgewater. I kept going back because I couldn't figure out how he was doing it. Was he cheating? No, that was the infuriating part. He was just better. Better at reading faces, better at calculating odds, better at knowing when to fold. He was a farmer who played cards like a mathematician, and he had this laugh, this stupid, loud laugh that came out of nowhere whenever he won a hand, like he couldn't believe his own luck even though it wasn't luck at all. Ronan stopped. When he spoke again, his voice was flatter, more controlled. His wife's name is Catherine. Their kids are 7 and 4. The boy is named William. The girl is named Rose. She has freckles and she's afraid of thunderstorms, and the last time I saw her, she asked me if I was going to bring her father back. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, that I couldn't, that some things can't be fixed, only answered for. Elena pulled her knees up to her chest. The cold was settling in now, the mountain air biting through her thin shirt. She was still wearing the clothes Briggs's men had dragged her out of the storeroom in. A cotton shirt with one sleeve torn, canvas trousers that were too big and held up with a piece of rope, and boots that had belonged to her father and were 2 sizes too large. There's a spare coat in the right pack, Ronan said, as though reading her mind. It'll be big on you, but it's wool. She found it and pulled it on. It smelled like horse and dust and something faintly medicinal, camphor maybe, or liniment. It was enormous on her, hanging past her knees, and the sleeves covered her hands entirely. She rolled them up and felt marginally more human. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. We haven't done anything yet. You cut my ropes. That counts as something. It counts as the easy part. They sat in the dark, and the night settled around them like something with weight. After a while, Elena said, Tell me about Wren Valley. Everything you know. Ronan shifted against the rock. Hollister mapped it in 1858, 3,000 acres, give or take, in a basin between the Sadler Range and the Eastern Escarpment. Good grass, permanent water from snowmelt, timber on the upper slopes. The only practical access is through a gap in the Eastern Escarpment, a narrow canyon, maybe a quarter-mile long, that opens into the basin. There might be other ways in, but if they exist, they're goat trails. And Calloway knows about this valley. Calloway's been running cattle in and out of it for at least 2 years, as far as I can tell. He's got an operation in there, buildings, corrals, men. But it's not just a ranch. I think it's where he keeps his records, the real records, not the ones he files with the territorial office. Why would he keep incriminating documents? Because they're not incriminating to him. They're inventory. Think about it. He's been forging land claims across the entire territory. That means he needs to track which claims are real, which are forged, which properties he actually controls versus which ones are still in dispute. He needs original surveys to create convincing forgeries. He needs records of which officials he's paid, which judges he owns, which sheriffs look the other way. A man running an operation that size can't keep it all in his head. He needs a ledger. And you think that ledger is in Wren Valley? I think it's the only place it could be. He wouldn't keep it in town. Too many eyes, too much risk of fire or theft. He wouldn't keep it on any of his official properties because those are subject to territorial inspection. But a valley that doesn't appear on any modern map, accessible only through a canyon he controls, that's a vault. Elena thought about this. It made sense in the methodical, careful way that men like Calloway operated. Her father had always said that the most dangerous men weren't the ones who acted on impulse, but the ones who kept records. How many men does he have in there? She asked. At least a dozen, based on the supply runs I've tracked. Maybe more. Cowboys, guards, a few men who look more like clerks than fighters. He moves supplies in through the canyon on a regular schedule. Every 10 days, a wagon train of 3 to 4 wagons goes in and comes back empty. And the canyon, you said it's narrow? Narrow enough that 2 wagons can't pass each other. Rock walls on both sides, maybe 60 feet high. One man with a rifle could hold that canyon against 20, which means one man with a rifle could also keep us out. Which is why we're not going through the canyon. Elena looked at him, though she could barely see his face in the starlight. You said the canyon was the only practical access. I said practical, I didn't say only. He reached into his coat and produced the leather folder with the copied maps. There's a notation on Hollister's survey, a mark I couldn't interpret. It's on the western rim of the valley, up in the high country where the escarpment meets the Sadler Range. I've been up there. There's nothing visible, just rock and scree and a few stands of bristlecone pine. But Hollister marked something, a symbol I've never seen in any other survey. He handed her the maps. Elena held them up to the starlight, tilting them to catch enough illumination to read. She traced the lines with her fingertip, feeling the familiar patterns of Hollister's notation. the way his symbols connected and cross-referenced. "This mark," she said, touching a small geometric shape on the western rim. "I know what this is." "What?" "It's Hollister's symbol for a natural passage. Not a road, not a trail, a passage through rock. He used this same symbol on his survey of the Henderson claims near Virginia City. There's a natural tunnel system in the granite there, carved by an underground river that dried up centuries ago. Hollister was obsessed with them. He believed that the mountain ranges in this territory were riddled with these passages, and he marked every one he found. A tunnel? A tunnel, a fissure, a collapsed cave system, something that goes through the escarpment. If Hollister marked it, it exists. He didn't speculate on his surveys, he only marked what he'd personally verified. Ronan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. A cautious, fragile thing that sounded almost like hope. "Can you find it? The passage?" "If I can get to the western rim and orient myself to Hollister's bearings, with the 3-degree correction, yes, I can find it." "How long?" "From here? 2 days' ride to reach the high country, then however long it takes to locate the entrance. Could be hours, could be a full day. Depends on how well the copy matches the original and how much the terrain has changed since 1858. We don't have a lot of time. Once Briggs tells Calloway I took you, Calloway will double the guard on the canyon and send riders into the mountains looking for us. We'll have maybe 3 days before the search net gets too tight. Then we'd better not waste them." They left the camp before dawn, riding separately now. Elena on the bay mare, Ronan on the gray. The trail climbed steadily through pine forest and granite outcrops, following a route that Ronan had clearly scouted in advance, choosing terrain that would be difficult for larger groups to follow. Elena rode behind him and studied the way he moved through the landscape. There was nothing wasted in it. No unnecessary stops, no second-guessing at trail junctions, no moments of hesitation. He rode the way her father had plowed, with the grim mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this work so many times it had become part of his body's memory. But she also noticed the things that didn't fit the legend, the way he winced when he dismounted, favoring his left leg, the cough that came and went, dry and persistent, that he tried to cover with his hand, the way he occasionally paused and stared at nothing, his eyes unfocused, his face slack, as though his mind had gone somewhere he hadn't asked it to go. Around midday they stopped in a meadow to water the horses, and Elena asked, "How long have you been doing this?" "Doing what?" "Bounty hunting, tracking, whatever you call what you do." 12 years, roughly." "And before that?" He filled the canteens and didn't answer. "I told you about my father," Elena said. "Fair's fair?" "I don't believe in fair. I believe in useful." "Then here's something useful. I'm riding into the mountains with a man I've known for less than a day, and I'd like to know who he is." Ronan capped the canteen and hung it on his saddle. He stood there for a moment, one hand on the horse's neck, looking out at the meadow where wildflowers were blooming in patches of yellow and purple between the grass. "I was a surveyor's assistant," he said. "Before." Elena stared at him. "You were a surveyor?" "An assistant. I carried the equipment, held the chains, recorded the measurements. Worked for a man named Garrett out of Sacramento for 3 years. Learned enough to understand the work, not enough to do it myself." "Is that how you know about Hollister's maps?" "That's how I know about Hollister's maps. Garrett talked about him constantly, said he was the best surveyor who ever worked the Western Territories, and that his original surveys were worth more than the land they mapped, because they were the only truly accurate record of who owned what." "So how does a surveyor's assistant become a bounty hunter?" Ronan was quiet again. The wind moved through the meadow grass, and the horses pulled at their bits, wanting to graze. "Garrett was killed," he said finally, "over a survey dispute. 2 ranchers both claimed the same water rights, and when the survey showed one of them was wrong, the wrong one shot Garrett in the chest and left him in a dry creek bed. I found him 2 days later, buried him where he fell because I couldn't carry him and didn't have a wagon. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was a long time ago. But I went after the man who did it. Took me 6 weeks to track him to a mining camp near the Utah border. I brought him back to stand trial, and the territorial marshal gave me $50 for my trouble and asked if I'd be interested in doing it again." "And you said yes." I said yes because I didn't have anything else to say yes to. Garrett was the closest thing I had to family, and he was dead, and tracking the man who killed him was the first thing in my life that felt like it meant something, so I kept doing it. He mounted his horse with a grunt that suggested his left leg was bothering him more than he wanted to show. Your turn. Tell me something about yourself that isn't on a survey map. Elena guided the mare onto the trail behind him. Like what? Like why you didn't cry. Back at the auction. Most people would have. Most people haven't spent 3 weeks in a storeroom with no windows deciding what they will and will not give away for free. Tears are information. They tell people where you're weak. I decided I wasn't going to give Harlan Briggs any more information than he already had. That's a hard way to think. I learned it from a hard place. They rode through the afternoon as the terrain grew steeper and the air grew thinner. The pine forest gave way to rock and sparse grass, and the trail narrowed until it was barely wide enough for a single horse. Elena felt the altitude in her lungs, a tightness, a slight burning with each breath that she'd experienced before on the few occasions her father had taken her into the high country. Late in the afternoon, Ronan pulled up at a ridgeline and pointed east. Elena drew up beside him and looked. The mountains dropped away in a series of broken ridges and steep valleys, and beyond the last ridge, partially hidden by a shoulder of granite, she could see it, a wide green basin nestled between the peaks like a secret someone had kept for 1,000 years. Even from this distance, even in the hazy afternoon light, she could see the grass, impossibly green against the gray rock, and the silver thread of a creek winding through its center, and what looked like a cluster of buildings near the far end, tiny with distance. Wren Valley, Ronan said. Elena stared at it. She understood now why men would kill for it. In a territory of dust and scrub and marginal grassland, this valley was an oasis, the kind of land that settlers dreamed about, that they crossed a continent hoping to find. And it had been hidden, hoarded, kept off every map so that one man could have it all. My father knew about this place, she said quietly. Ronan looked at her. He never told me directly, but there were nights when he'd sit at the kitchen table with Hollister's map spread out in front of him, and he'd trace the lines with his finger and say, "Somewhere out there, Elena, there's a piece of land so good that men have forgotten what it looks like to be decent, and they'll do anything to keep it for themselves." I thought he was talking in the abstract, being philosophical, but he was talking about this. He may have been one of the first people to figure out what Calloway was doing. And that's what got him killed. That's what got him killed. Elena looked at the valley for a long time. Then she looked at the western rim, the high, jagged line of the escarpment where Hollister had marked his mysterious passage. We need to go there, she said, pointing. The western rim, where the escarpment meets the Saddler Ridge. That's where the passage is. That's a hard climb. We'll have to leave the horses at the tree line and go on foot. Then we leave the horses at the tree line and go on foot. Ronan studied her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and turned his horse down the ridge toward the tree line. They made camp that evening in a stand of bristlecone pines that clung to the mountainside at the edge of the timber. The trees were ancient, twisted, their trunks scoured smooth by centuries of wind. Ronan allowed a small fire this time, sheltered by a rock outcrop that would hide the light from the valley below, and Elena sat close to it and felt the warmth work its way into her bones. She spread the copied maps on the ground and studied them by firelight, making corrections with a charcoal pencil she'd found in Ronan's supplies. The 3-degree adjustment changed everything. Bearings that had seemed to point into empty rock now aligned with features she could see on the mountainside above them. A ridge here, a notch there, a particular formation that Hollister had noted with his distinctive geometric shorthand. I can see the route, she said. Hollister approached from the northwest, following the ridgeline. He notes a cairn at the junction of 2 drainages. If that cairn is still standing, it marks the beginning of the approach to the passage. And if it's not still standing? Then I'll navigate by the terrain features. He describes a split rock at the entrance, a boulder that cracked naturally along its fault line, leaving a gap wide enough for a man to pass through. Beyond that, according to his notes, there's a descending passage that goes through the escarpment and emerges on the valley floor, approximately 300 feet below the rim. 300 feet of descent through an underground passage. Ronan said it the way someone might describe a dental procedure. In the dark. Hollister did it in 1858, with a candle. Hollister was apparently a lunatic. Hollister was a surveyor. They're the same thing. Ronan almost smiled again, that barely there twitch at the corner of his mouth that Elena was beginning to recognize as his version of laughing out loud. "Get some sleep," he said. "We start climbing at first light." Elena lay down near the fire, wrapped in the oversized coat, and stared at the sky through the twisted branches of the bristlecone pines. She thought about her father's hands, the way they'd looked spread across the survey maps on the kitchen table, rough, calloused, the nails broken from farm work, but steady, always steady. He'd moved his finger along Hollister's bearing lines with the same care other men reserved for scripture, tracing the measurements of the world with a reverence that she'd inherited without knowing it. She thought about the auction platform, the way the rope had felt on her wrists, the way Pudge Wiley had described her, healthy, strong, good teeth, and the way the crowd had listened to that description, and not one person had said this is wrong. She thought about Harlan Briggs' smile, patient, tolerant, the smile of a man who had never in his life been told no and meant it. And she thought about Ronan Vale's hands cutting the rope, the knife sliding through the fibers with a soft, tearing sound, and the sudden rush of blood back into her fingers, painful and bright, like coming back to life after being dead for a very long time. She didn't trust him completely. Trust was a thing she'd been running low on for 3 weeks, and the reserves hadn't magically refilled just because a stranger had done one decent thing. But she trusted the anger she'd seen in his eyes when he talked about James Farrow dying in his yard. She trusted the way his voice had changed when he said the name Rose. And she trusted that he wanted what she wanted. Not revenge, not glory, but proof. Documentation. The cold, indifferent weight of facts that no judge could ignore and no amount of money could erase. She fell asleep with the fire dying beside her and the wind singing through the pines and the mountains rising above her like the walls of something enormous and ancient and entirely indifferent to the small, desperate plans of the people crawling across its surface. Ronan sat awake for another hour, watching the darkness beyond the firelight. He'd been doing this long enough to know the difference between a night that was simply dark and a night that had people in it, and tonight felt empty. Just wind and rock and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. But he also knew that empty nights didn't last. Briggs would have riders in the mountains by tomorrow. Calloway, once he got word, would do something worse, something calculated and patient and designed to cut off every exit before the quarry even realized it was surrounded. He looked at Elena, asleep by the fire, her face slack and young and bruised, her wrists wrapped in strips of cloth he'd given her to keep the rope burns clean. She was 23 years old, and she'd been orphaned and robbed and imprisoned and sold in a public square, and she'd come through all of it with her mind sharp and her spine straight and her knowledge intact. And if they survived the next 3 days, she might actually be the key to bringing down an empire that had been crushing people for years. And if they didn't survive the next 3 days, then they'd be 2 more names on a list that was already too long. And the empire would keep crushing, and the valley would stay hidden, and the records would stay buried, and nothing would change. He added a piece of wood to the fire, carefully, so as not to wake her. Then he leaned back against the rock and settled in to wait for dawn, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol, his eyes on the darkness, and the cold mountain air pressing against him like a hand trying to push him back down the mountain and away from everything that waited in the valley below. Orchestrated climactic narrative segment with seamless continuity. The climb nearly killed them before the valley had a chance to. Elena woke to Ronan shaking her shoulder in the gray half-light before dawn, and they broke camp in silence, packing what they could carry on their backs and hobbling the horses in the bristlecone stand with enough water and forage to last 2 days. Ronan strapped on a canvas pack with rope, a lantern, matches, ammunition, and enough food for 3 meals. Elena carried the maps, the charcoal pencil, and a compass she'd found in Ronan's supplies, a battered brass instrument that had seen better decades but still held true. The terrain above the tree line was brutal. Loose scree that shifted under every step, rock faces that required scrambling on hands and knees, and a wind that came off the high peaks with the kind of sustained, mindless fury that made conversation impossible. Elena's borrowed boots, 2 sizes too large, slipped and caught on every surface, and by the time they reached the first ridgeline, her ankles were bleeding where the leather had rubbed through her socks. She didn't mention it. Ronan was having his own troubles. His left leg was visibly worse on the steep grades, and twice she saw him grab his knee with both hands and straighten it manually, like resetting a hinge that had gone crooked. Old injury? She asked when the wind died enough to talk. Old enough to have its own opinions about altitude. What happened? Horse fell on it. 3 years ago, outside of Prescott. The bone set wrong, and the doctor who re-broke it to set it right was drunk, so it set wrong a second time. Now it works fine on flat ground and turns into a piece of furniture above 8,000 feet. We're above 9,000. I'm aware. They pushed on. Elena navigated by the corrected maps, matching Hollister's bearings to the terrain features she could identify. A distinctive notch in the ridgeline to the northwest, a granite spire that rose like a broken finger from the eastern escarpment, the dry bed of a seasonal creek that cut across the slope in a line Hollister had drawn with his typical precision. By mid-morning, she found the cairn. It was barely standing, a stack of flat stones that had been carefully balanced 68 years ago and had spent every day since then being pummeled by wind and ice and the slow, patient work of gravity. 3 of the original stones had fallen, but the base was still intact, and on the bottom stone Elena found what she was looking for, a small geometric mark chiseled into the surface with a surveyor's tool. Hollister's mark, she said, crouching beside it. Same symbol he used on every reference cairn. We're on his route. How far to the passage? Elena consulted the maps, adjusting for the terrain she could see. The escarpment rose above them in a wall of dark granite, cracked and weathered but essentially vertical. Somewhere in that wall was a split rock with a gap wide enough to enter. Northwest along the base of the escarpment, maybe a quarter mile. He notes the entrance at the junction of 2 fracture lines in the granite. Look for a place where the rock face changes direction, like a corner. They followed the base of the escarpment, picking their way through boulders that had calved off the cliff face over the centuries. The wind was relentless up here, a constant pressure against their bodies that made every step an argument. Elena's lips were cracked and her eyes watered, and the thin air made her heart pound harder than the exertion warranted. She almost walked past it. The split rock didn't look like an entrance. It looked like a shadow, a dark vertical line in the granite face that could have been a crack, a stain, a trick of the light. Elena stopped and backed up 3 steps and looked at it again, then looked at the map, then looked at the rock. Here, she said. Ronan came up beside her and studied the crack. It was maybe 2 feet wide at its widest point, narrowing to less than a foot at the top. The rock on either side was smooth, almost polished, the way stone gets when water has been running over it for a very long time. You're sure? The bearing matches, the elevation matches, and look at the rock surface. It's water-worn. There's a passage behind this, or there was. Hollister wouldn't have marked it if he hadn't gone through. Ronan peered into the crack. Darkness. Complete, absolute darkness that seemed to have substance, like something poured into the space between the rocks. Ladies first, he said. Oh, you're hilarious. I wasn't joking. You're smaller. If it narrows, you'll fit where I won't. He had a point, which Elena found irritating. She took the lantern from his pack, lit it, and held it up to the crack. The light penetrated maybe 10 feet before the passage curved and the darkness swallowed it. If I die in there, Elena said, tell people I died doing something more dignified than crawling through a hole in a mountain. Like what? I don't know, a gunfight, a stampede, anything but a hole. She turned sideways and edged into the crack. The rock pressed against her chest and back simultaneously, and for 3 or 4 steps she could barely breathe. Not from the air, which was cool and surprisingly fresh, but from the sheer claustrophobic pressure of stone on both sides of her body, inches away, close enough to feel the cold radiating off it. Then the passage widened. Not by much, well, maybe 4 feet, but enough that she could face forward and hold the lantern at arm's length. The floor was smooth, sloping gently downward, and the walls were covered in mineral deposits that caught the lamplight and threw it back in flickers of orange and white. It opens up, she called back. Come through. She heard Ronan grunting and scraping his way through the crack, his pack catching on the rock, his breathing harsh and echoing in the confined space. He emerged into the wider passage, looking like he'd been in a fight with a chimney. I hate this, he said, brushing dust off his coat. Noted. Keep moving. The passage descended in a series of irregular steps, some natural, some that looked like they'd been modified. Rough-cut footholds chiseled into the rock at points where the slope was too steep to navigate without them. Hollister's work, Elena thought, or possibly someone before Hollister. The chiseling looked old, very old. They went down. The air grew warmer as they descended, and the passage widened and narrowed unpredictably, sometimes opening into small chambers where the lantern light couldn't reach the ceiling, sometimes squeezing down to corridors where they had to duck and shuffle. Water appeared on the walls, not flowing, but seeping, a constant weeping moisture that made the rock slippery and the air heavy. "How far down are we?" Ronan asked. Based on Hollister's notes, the passage descends about 300 feet over a horizontal distance of maybe a quarter mile. "We've been going down for 20 minutes. I'd guess we're about 2/3 through." "You'd guess." "I'd calculate, but I left my surveying equipment in my other kidnapping outfit." Ronan made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been his knee popping. It was hard to tell underground. They continued in silence for another 10 minutes. Then the passage leveled out, curved to the right, and Elena saw something she hadn't expected. Light. Not lantern light. Natural light, gray and diffuse, seeping in from somewhere ahead. She extinguished the lantern and they moved forward carefully, feeling the air change from the stale coolness of underground to something warmer, greener, touched with the smell of grass and water and pine. The passage ended in a tumble of rocks and brush that partially concealed the opening. Elena pushed through the undergrowth and stepped out onto a ledge about 30 feet above the valley floor, hidden behind a screen of juniper and mountain laurel that grew from the cracks in the rock. Wren Valley spread out below her, and it took her breath away in a way that the thin mountain air hadn't managed. It was more beautiful than she'd imagined from the ridgeline. The grass was thick and green, fed by a creek that wound through the basin in lazy curves. Stands of cottonwood and pine dotted the valley floor, and the mountains rose on all sides like walls, their granite faces catching the midday sun. Birds wheeled overhead, hawks mostly, riding the thermals that rose from the warm valley floor. And at the far end, maybe 2 miles from where Elena stood, was Price Calloway's operation. She could see it clearly from this elevation, a cluster of buildings arranged around a central structure that was larger and more substantial than a ranch house. It looked more like a trading post or a small fort. Thick walls, narrow windows, a flat roof with what appeared to be a lookout post at one corner. Around it were corrals, a barn, a bunkhouse, and several smaller outbuildings that could have been storage sheds or offices. Men moved between the buildings. Elena counted 8 that she could see, but there were probably more inside. Horses in the corrals, a wagon parked near the barn, smoke rising from 2 chimneys. Ronan crouched beside her and studied the compound with narrowed eyes. "Bigger than I expected." "How many men do you count?" 8 visible. Figure double that total, 16, maybe 20. "And we are 2. "We are 2. Elena looked at the compound and felt the gap between what she wanted to do and what was actually possible yawning open beneath her, like the passage they'd just descended. 2 people against 16 or 20, in a valley with one known exit that was certainly guarded, and one secret exit that involved climbing 300 feet through a crack in a mountain. "We don't need to fight them," she said, thinking out loud. "We need to find the records and get out. If Calloway keeps his ledgers in that main building, he does, has to. That's the most defensible structure. Anything valuable is in there. Then we need to get inside that building without being seen by 20 men. 16 to 20! Thank you, that's much more encouraging." They spent the rest of the afternoon on the ledge, watching the compound through a gap in the juniper screen. Elena mapped the patterns. When men came and went, which buildings they entered, where the guards were posted, when shifts changed. Ronan watched the perimeter, noting blind spots and approach routes. By late afternoon, they'd assembled a picture that was less hopeless than Elena had initially feared. The compound's security was oriented toward the canyon entrance to the east. Guards were posted watching the canyon approach, the main trail through the valley, and the approaches from the north and south. But the western side, the escarpment side, where the rock wall rose straight up behind the compound, had almost no security. Why would it? Nobody could come from that direction. Nobody could get through the escarpment. Nobody except 2 people who'd just done exactly that. "There's a blind spot," Elena said, pointing, "between the main building and the escarpment wall. That smaller outbuilding, but the one with no chimney, blocks the line of sight from the corrals. If we come down from the ledge after dark, we can reach the back wall of the main building without being seen from any of the guard positions. And then what? Walk through the front door? There's a window on the west wall. I've been watching it. Nobody's gone near it all day. It's either a back room or a storeroom. Either way, it's our best entry point. Ronan chewed on this. It's thin. Everything about this is thin. We're two people hiding on a rock ledge with a lantern and a bad knee and a pair of boots that don't fit. Thin is the best we've got. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Your father would be proud of you." It hit her harder than she expected. She turned away and looked at the valley and blinked several times and said, "My father would tell me I'm being reckless." Being reckless and making him proud aren't mutually exclusive. They waited for dark. The sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the valley filled with shadow, like a bowl filling with water. The compound lit up. Lanterns in windows. A bonfire near the bunkhouse where men gathered to eat, the orange glow of tobacco from the guard positions. Elena watched the patterns change as the day shift gave way to the night shift, counting heads, tracking movements. At full dark, they descended from the ledge. It was slow, painful work, climbing down 30 feet of rock face in the dark, feeling for handholds, trying not to dislodge stones that would clatter down and announce their presence. Ronan's knee nearly gave out twice, and both times Elena heard him catch his breath in a way that told her the pain was worse than anything he'd admit. They reached the valley floor and moved through the grass in a low crouch, angling toward the compound's western wall. The night was cold and still, and every sound, the crunch of grass under their boots, the distant lowing of cattle in the corrals, the murmur of voices from the bunkhouse, seemed amplified in the valley's natural acoustics. It took them 40 minutes to cover the distance. 40 minutes of crawling, crouching, stopping, listening, moving again. Elena's heart was hammering so hard she was certain it was audible. Her mouth tasted like copper, and her hands were shaking, and she kept thinking about the auction platform in Coulter's Bend, and how afraid she'd been then, and how that fear was nothing compared to this. They reached the back wall of the main building. Elena pressed her back against the stone and breathed shallow, controlled breaths that she forced through her teeth. Ronan was beside her, his pistol drawn, his eyes scanning the darkness. The window was right where she'd seen it, a narrow opening about 5 feet off the ground, shuttered from the inside but not latched. Elena eased the shutter open an inch and peered in. A dark room, shapes of shelves and boxes, no light, no movement. She opened the shutter wider, pulled herself up, and slid through the window head first, landing on a wooden floor with a thump that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. She froze, holding her breath, listening. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no alarm. She turned and helped Ronan through the window, which was harder. He was bigger, his pack caught on the frame, and his knee buckled as he came through, sending him stumbling into a shelf that rattled, but didn't fall. They stood in the dark room and waited. A minute, two. No one came. Elena lit a match. They were in a storeroom, as she'd guessed. Shelves lined with canned goods, sacks of flour, boxes of ammunition. A door on the far wall led deeper into the building. Ronan tried the door. Unlocked. He opened it a crack and looked through. A hallway, dimly lit by a single lantern at the far end, doors on both sides. Empty. They moved down the hallway, checking doors. A bedroom, unmade, smelling of whiskey and tobacco. A kitchen. A room with nothing in it but a broken chair. And then, at the end of the hall, a door that was different from the others. Heavier, reinforced with iron bands, with a lock that was newer and shinier than anything else in the building. "That's it," Ronan whispered. He knelt in front of the lock and produced a set of picks from his coat. Thin metal tools that he worked with a delicacy that seemed impossible for his large, scarred hands. Elena stood watch facing the hallway, listening to the distant sounds of the compound and trying to breathe normally while her pulse roared in her ears. The lock clicked open. The room behind the door was an office. A real office. A desk, a chair, a cabinet with glass doors, shelves stacked with ledgers and file boxes and rolled documents. A lamp sat on the desk, and Ronan lit it with the wick turned low, casting just enough light to work by. Elena went straight to the shelves. She pulled down the first ledger and opened it, and what she saw made her hands go cold. Names, dates, properties. Page after page of entries in neat, careful handwriting, documenting every land transaction Price Calloway had orchestrated over the past 8 years. And beside each entry, in a separate column, a notation indicating whether the transaction was legitimate or forged. "Ronan," she whispered. "Look at this." He came to the desk and looked over her shoulder. She turned pages, and as she turned them, the scope of what they were looking at became clear. 43 properties. 43 families whose land had been taken through forged documents, bribed officials, intimidated witnesses. Each entry meticulous, detailed, cross-referenced to original survey numbers and filing dates and the names of the officials who had been paid to look the other way. He documented everything, Elena said. Every bribe, every forgery, every fake claim. He kept records of his own crimes. "He's a businessman," Ronan said. "Businessmen keep books." Elena pulled down another ledger. This one contained copies of the original surveys, Hollister's surveys, the genuine ones, alongside the forged versions that Calloway had filed with the territorial office. The differences were subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew Hollister's work, bearing corrections that had been removed, boundary markers that had been shifted, water rights that had been reassigned. "This is everything," Elena said. "This is enough to convict him 10 times over. Every forge, every bribe, every stolen acre, it's all right here." She was reaching for a third ledger when a voice said, "I figured you'd find your way in eventually." Elena spun. Ronan's pistol came up so fast it was barely a movement, more like the gun had simply appeared in his hand, pointed at the door. A man stood in the doorway. He was perhaps 50, thin, with gray hair cropped close to his skull and pale blue eyes that caught the lamplight and held it. He wore a plain white shirt, no coat, no hat, and his hands were at his sides, empty. He looked like a schoolteacher. He looked like someone's uncle. He looked like the last person you'd suspect of stealing 43 families' land and ruining their lives. "Price Calloway," Ronan said. "Mr. Vale, I've heard a great deal about you." Calloway's voice was mild, conversational, the way someone might speak at a dinner party. He looked at Elena. "And Miss Cross, I must say I'm impressed. The passage through the escarpment, that was Hollister's discovery, wasn't it? I've had men looking for an alternate route into this valley for 2 years. I should have hired a surveyor's daughter instead of cowboys." "Put your hands up," Ronan said. "There are 12 men in the bunkhouse 50 yards from here, Mr. Vale. If I raise my voice, they'll be through that door in under a minute. So before you do anything dramatic, let's discuss this like reasonable people." "There's nothing to discuss," Elena said. "We have your records. Every forged claim, every bribed judge, every stolen property. This is over." Calloway looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "Is it? Let's think about that. You're standing in a valley with one exit, which my men control. The passage you came through is, I assume, somewhere on the western escarpment. I'll find it by morning. You're 2 people with 1 gun, and I have 20 armed men within shouting distance. So when you say, 'This is over,' I'm curious about the mechanism you're imagining." "We got in," Elena said. "We'll get out." "Perhaps. But the records stay here. You can't carry 4 shelves of ledgers through a crack in a mountain. You could take 1 or 2 maybe, but the rest, the bulk of the evidence, stays in this room. And without the complete set, any case you try to bring will be fragmentary. A good lawyer, and I have very good lawyers, will argue that isolated documents prove nothing, that they could have been fabricated, that they were taken under duress by a fugitive and a bounty hunter with a personal grudge." He was right. Elena felt the logic of it settle over her like cold water. A few stolen ledgers wouldn't be enough. Calloway's lawyers would drown them in counterarguments, technicalities, jurisdictional challenges. She'd seen it happen to her father, the system working exactly as it was designed to work, grinding down anyone who didn't have enough money to make it work in their favor. "You've thought about this," she said. "I think about everything, Miss Cross. That's why I'm standing here and your father isn't." The words hit her like a physical blow. She saw Ronan's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the muscle in his jaw flex, and for a moment she thought he would shoot Calloway right there in his own office, and part of her wanted him to. But killing Calloway wouldn't bring back her father. It wouldn't restore 43 stolen properties. It wouldn't free the territory from the network of corruption he'd built over 8 years. It would just make them murderers, and the system would continue without him, because men like Calloway always had successors. "Don't," she said to Ronan. He's not worth the bullet. Ronan held the gun steady for another 3 seconds. Then he lowered it, slowly, and Elena saw something in his eyes that looked like it cost him. Calloway smiled. Sensible. Now, here's what I propose. I'm not done, Elena said. Something in her voice made Calloway pause. It wasn't volume. She spoke quietly, almost softly, but there was a quality to it, a density, like a wire pulled tight enough to hum. You're right that we can't carry all your records through the mountain. You're right that a few ledgers won't be enough in court. You're right that your lawyers could tie any case up for years. She took a breath. But you're wrong about one thing. And what's that? You think the only courtroom that matters is one with a judge, but there's another one, a bigger one you can't buy. Calloway's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker. Uncertainty, maybe? Or the beginning of it. I've been reading your records for 3 minutes, Elena said, and I can already tell you the names of 14 families whose land you stole, the dates of 26 forged documents, and the amounts of 11 bribes paid to territorial officials. I have a very good memory, Mr. Calloway. My father made sure of that, and I don't need to carry your ledgers through a mountain. I just need to remember what's in them. She turned to the shelves and began pulling down ledgers, opening them, scanning the pages. Her eyes moved across the entries with the same focused intensity she'd used to read Hollister's surveys, absorbing, cataloging, filing the information in the architecture of her mind the way her father had taught her to file survey data, systematically, precisely, so it could be reconstructed from memory at any time. What are you doing? Calloway asked, and for the first time his voice had an edge to it. Reading. Stop that. Make me. Calloway looked at Ronan, whose gun was lowered but whose eyes hadn't left Calloway's face. He looked at the door, calculating. He could call for his men. He could have them both taken, both killed, both buried in the valley where no one would ever find them. But Ronan Vale had a gun and a reputation. And even if Calloway's men overwhelmed them, people would die, and the noise would carry and questions would be asked. And there was something else, something Calloway hadn't considered until this moment. If Elena Cross had already memorized enough of his records to be dangerous, and looking at her eyes, the way they moved across the pages with that terrifying mechanical precision, then killing her now might not be enough. She might have already told someone. She might have left a letter, a note, instructions in case she didn't come back. The only way to be sure was to know what she knew, and the only way to know that was to keep her alive and talking. Elena read for 12 minutes. She went through 6 ledgers, scanning each page with a concentration so intense that the rest of the room seemed to cease to exist for her. Names, dates, properties, amounts, officials, signatures, forged survey numbers, corrected bearings. She took it all in, page by page, and filed it in the place inside her head where Hollister's maps lived, where her father's voice still guided her through the geometry of the world. When she was done, she closed the last ledger and placed it back on the shelf. Now, she said, turning to Calloway with a face that was pale and streaked with dust and utterly, completely certain, you have a choice. You can let us walk out of this valley right now, tonight, or you can kill us and spend the rest of your life wondering who I told and what I wrote down and whether the next knock on your door is a federal marshal with a warrant. Your decision. The room was very quiet. The lamplight flickered. Outside, somewhere in the compound, a man laughed and another man told him to shut up. And the sound was so ordinary and so distant that it might have come from another world entirely. Calloway looked at Elena Cross, 23 years old, bruised, exhausted, standing in his office in an oversized coat and borrowed boots with rope burns on her wrists. And for the first time in 8 years of careful, methodical, patient empire building, he had no idea what to do. Calloway let them go. Not out of mercy. Elena could see that much in his face. Mercy was a currency he didn't trade in. He let them go because she'd planted a seed of doubt in his mind that was more dangerous than any bullet, and he needed time to think, time to calculate, time to figure out how much she actually knew and who she might have told, and what kind of damage control was possible. He stood in the doorway of his office and watched them back down the hallway, Ronan's gun covering their retreat, and his expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic, running numbers, weighing costs, measuring the distance between what he controlled and what he didn't. You have 24 hours, he said as they reached the storeroom. After that, every man I own will be looking for you. And Miss Cross, you should know that a memory, no matter how impressive, isn't evidence. It's testimony, and testimony can be discredited. It can also be corroborated, Elena said. Ask your friend Harlan Briggs how comfortable he feels right now. She climbed through the window first, dropping into the darkness outside, and Ronan followed, grunting as his knee took the impact. They moved fast across the open ground between the compound and the escarpment, crouching low, and Elena expected a shout, a gunshot, the sudden chaos of discovery at every step. But nothing came. The compound stayed quiet behind them, and the night stayed dark around them. And by the time they reached the base of the escarpment and began the climb to the passage entrance, the only sound was their own ragged breathing and the wind. The climb back through the passage was worse than the descent. 300 feet of vertical gain through a crack in the mountain, in the dark, with exhaustion pulling at their legs and the adrenaline fading into a sick, shaky emptiness that made Elena's hands tremble on the rock. Ronan's knee gave out completely on the final ascent, and she had to grab his arm and brace her feet against the passage wall and haul him up the last 6 feet while his teeth clenched so hard she could hear them grinding. They emerged onto the ledge in the gray light of pre-dawn, gasping, filthy, and Elena sat down on the rock and put her head between her knees and breathed until the black spots stopped swimming across her vision. That was the worst experience of my life, Ronan said, lying flat on his back on the ledge with his bad legs stretched out straight. And I once spent 3 days in a box canyon eating cactus. We need to move. He said 24 hours, but he was lying. He'll have riders out by morning. I know. Ronan didn't move. Give me 1 minute. You have 30 seconds. You're a cruel woman, Elena Cross. I'm a practical woman. Get up. They retrieved the horses from the bristlecone stand and rode west, away from the valley, pushing hard through terrain that fought them at every step. Elena's mind was working the entire time, turning over the problem from every angle the way her father had taught her to approach a survey, systematically, looking for the point where the lines converged. Calloway was right about one thing. Her memory alone wouldn't be enough. Testimony could be attacked, discredited, buried under procedural challenges. She needed something more, something physical, something that couldn't be argued away. We're not going to San Francisco, she said, as they descended through the pine forest toward the lower valleys. Ronan looked back at her. That was the plan. The plan has changed. We're going back to Coulter's Bend. He pulled his horse up and turned fully in the saddle. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and something that looked disturbingly close to alarm. Back to the town that auctioned you off 3 days ago. Back to the town that auctioned me off 3 days ago. The town where Harlan Briggs has a $10,000 bounty on my head. That's the one. Have you lost your mind? No, I found it. Elena pulled up beside him. Listen to me. Calloway is right that testimony alone isn't enough. And running to San Francisco means weeks of travel, weeks during which Calloway moves his records, destroys evidence, pays off anyone who might corroborate what I know. By the time we reach a federal judge, there'll be nothing left to prove. So what's in Coulter's Bend? The Founders' Day gathering. It happens every year, last weekend of the month. Every rancher, settler, merchant, and official in the territory comes to town for 3 days of trading, socializing, and political business. Judges, marshals, territorial representatives, they'll all be there, including Judge Henry Alcorn from the 9th Federal District. Ronan stared at her. You want to present evidence at a social gathering. I want to present evidence in front of the largest assembly of witnesses this territory has ever seen. Every family whose land was stolen will have members in that crowd. Every official who took a bribe will be standing within earshot. If I name names, dates, and amounts in front of 300 people, Calloway can't make it disappear. It's not testimony in a courtroom. It's a public accusation witnessed by the entire territory. It becomes the story. It becomes the thing everyone knows and nobody can deny. And it becomes a death sentence for both of us. It's already a death sentence. Calloway gave us 24 hours and meant 12. Briggs has your bounty posted at every way station between here and Nevada. We're already dead if they catch us. The only question is whether we die having accomplished something or die running. Ronan was quiet for a long time. The horses shifted beneath them, and the pine forest creaked in the morning wind, and somewhere a jay screamed at something in the underbrush. The Farrow family, he said finally. What about them? James Farrow. Catherine. William and Rose. They're one of the 43 families in Calloway's ledger. Entry number 17, property stolen through a forged quit-claim deed, dated March 14th of last year. Bribe of $300 paid to a filing clerk in the territorial office named Patterson. The forgery was based on a modified Hollister survey. Bearing corrections removed, property boundary shifted 600 yards south to exclude the water rights that made the land valuable. Ronan stared at her. You memorized all of that. I memorized all 43. Names, dates, amounts, methods. Every entry. In 12 minutes. My father had me memorizing survey data before I could write. A bearing, a distance, a landmark. He'd read them off once and expect me to repeat them back. He said paper burns and ink fades, but what you carry in your head belongs to you forever. He was training you.
But he was raising me.
They were the same thing. They rode hard for 2 days. The route back to Coulter's Bend was different from the route out. Elena insisted on a longer, more circuitous path that took them south through the sage flats before swinging west and approaching the town from a direction nobody would expect. They rode through daylight and into darkness, stopped only when the horses couldn't go any further, and slept in shifts, 2 hours at a time, on the ground beside cold camps with no fires. On the first night, while Elena stood watch and Ronan slept with his hat over his face and his gun in his hand, she went through the ledger entries in her mind, one by one, checking herself against the details she'd absorbed. Entry number 1, the Coltrane property, 80 acres, forged warranty deed dated June of 1871, bribe of $250 to Judge Whitfield. Entry number 2, the Sung claim, 120 acres, forged mineral rights transfer. Margaret Sung's signature replicated from a general store account ledger that Calloway's men had stolen from the merchant who kept it. She went through all 43 entries and found that she could recall everyone. Not perfectly. There were a few amounts she was uncertain of, a few dates that blurred at the edges, but enough. More than enough to stand in front of a crowd and recite a litany of crimes so detailed and so specific that no one could dismiss it as a grieving woman's accusations. On the second day, they encountered trouble. They were crossing a dry wash about 15 miles south of Coulter's Bend when Ronan pulled up sharp and raised his hand. Elena stopped the mare and listened. Hoofbeats. Not close, but not far. Maybe half a mile, on the other side of a low ridge to the north.
How many?
She whispered.
3, maybe 4, moving east to west along the ridgeline.
Briggs men. Or Calloway's. Doesn't matter. If they spot us, they'll either shoot or ride for reinforcements, and we can't outrun either outcome on tired horses. They dismounted and led the horses into a dry creek bed, pressing against the bank where the overhang of packed earth and dead grass provided some cover. Elena held the mare's muzzle, stroking her nose to keep her quiet, while Ronan crouched at the edge of the bank with his rifle, watching the ridgeline. The riders appeared, 4 of them, dark shapes against the bright sky, moving at a steady trot. Elena recognized one of them, Cal Stoddard, the deputy from Coulter's Bend, his badge flashing in the sunlight. The others were hired men, rough-looking, armed, scanning the terrain with the methodical sweep of a search party. They passed within 200 yards. One of the horses whinnied, and Elena's mare tossed her head and tried to answer, and Elena pressed her hand harder against the soft nose and whispered words she'd used to calm frightened animals her entire life. Meaningless syllables, rhythmic, soothing, the kind of sounds that bypass language and go straight to the animal brain. The mare settled, the riders passed, the hoofbeats faded east. They're searching the eastern approaches, Ronan said. They think we're still in the mountains. Then the southern approach will be clear. Maybe. Or maybe they've got more men covering more ground than we think. We don't have a choice, Ronan. The gathering starts tomorrow. If we miss it, we miss our window. He looked at her, and she saw the calculation in his eyes, the professional assessment of risk that had kept him alive for 12 years of tracking dangerous men through dangerous country. He was measuring the odds, and the odds were bad, and they both knew it. One thing, he said, if we get into that town and things go wrong, which they will because things always go wrong, you do the talking and I'll handle the rest. What does the rest mean? It means whatever it needs to mean. They reached the outskirts of Coulter's Bend at dawn on the third day. Riding in from the south through a landscape of scattered homesteads and fenced pastures, that Elena knew like the back of her hand. She'd ridden these roads with her father 100 times. To town for supplies, to neighbors' houses for Sunday dinners, to the creek for fishing on summer evenings when the light lasted forever and the world seemed like a place where things made sense. The town was already swelling with Founders' Day visitors. Wagons lined the approaches, and temporary camps had sprung up in the fields around the settlement. Families from outlying ranches, merchants with goods to sell, cowboys looking for work or whiskey, or both. It was the biggest gathering of the year, and the streets of Coulter's Bend were busier than Elena had ever seen them. "That's our advantage," she said, studying the town from a rise a quarter-mile out. "In a crowd this size, 2 more faces won't stand out. My face will. Briggs has my description posted in every saloon and trading post in the territory. Then keep your hat down and stay close to me." They left the horses at a livery stable on the south end of town, paying the stablemen with the last of Ronan's cash, and walked into Coulter's Bend on foot. Elena had traded the oversized coat for a canvas jacket she'd found in Ronan's supplies, and she'd tucked her hair under a hat and dirtied her face with trail dust until she looked like just another settler's wife come to town for the gathering. Ronan couldn't disguise himself as easily. He was too tall, too lean, too recognizably not ordinary, but the crowd was thick enough to provide cover, and he walked with his shoulders hunched and his collar up and his hat pulled so low he could barely see. The main square, the same square where Elena had been auctioned 4 days ago, was set up for the gathering. A raised platform at one end served as a speaking stage, and wooden benches had been arranged in rows facing it. Bunting hung from the storefronts, and a banner across the main street read, "Founders' Day, 1876," in red and blue letters that were already fading in the sun. Elena scanned the crowd. She recognized faces. Settlers, ranchers, townspeople, the ordinary population of the territory going about its ordinary business of trading and socializing and pretending that nothing was wrong. And among them, standing apart in their clean clothes and polished boots, were the men who ran things, territorial officials, judges, merchants who had made their money through legitimate means, and others who hadn't. She spotted Judge Henry Alcorn near the platform, a tall man with white hair and a bearing that suggested he'd been important for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be otherwise. He was talking with 2 men Elena didn't recognize, holding a cup of coffee, looking bored. "There's the judge," she said to Ronan, "and there's Briggs." Elena followed his gaze. Harlan Briggs was standing on the porch of his office across the square, leaning against a post, surveying the crowd with the proprietary satisfaction of a man looking at something he owned. Cal Stoddard was beside him, along with 2 men Elena didn't recognize, hired guns, from the look of them, with new revolvers and the empty, watchful faces of professionals. "He's got extra men," Ronan said. "At least 4 that I can see who aren't his usual crew. He's expecting trouble." "He's expecting us." "Probably. The question is whether he knows we're already here." Elena looked at the platform. The speaking program was posted on a board beside it. A list of speakers for the day's public session, starting at noon. The territorial representative would speak first, then the mayor, then Judge Alcorn. After that, the schedule showed open forum, Detchel, citizens' business. "Citizens' business," Elena said. "That's our moment. Anyone can speak during open forum. It's tradition. Tradition won't stop a bullet." "No, but 300 witnesses might slow one down." They spent the morning positioned at different points around the square, watching Briggs' men, tracking their movements, identifying sight lines and exit routes. Ronan was professional about it, moving through the crowd with the careful, unhurried pace of a man who is simply attending a gathering, stopping to look at merchandise, leaning against buildings, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention. Elena found a spot near the platform where she could see the speaker's podium and the crowd beyond it. She went through the ledger entries one more time, organizing them in her mind, deciding which ones to lead with, which names would hit hardest, which details would be impossible to dismiss. At noon, the speaking program began. The territorial representative gave a speech about progress and prosperity. That was so boring, Elena nearly felt sorry for the crowd. The mayor was worse. Judge Alcorn spoke briefly about the importance of law on the frontier, and Elena listened to his words and measured them against what she knew about his record, and decided that he was either honest or very good at pretending. Then the moderator, Tom Everly, the dry goods merchant who hadn't been able to look Elena in the eye at the auction, stood at the podium and announced the open forum. Any citizen with business to bring before the community may now address the gathering, he said, and his voice carried across the square with the practiced projection of a man who'd been doing this for years. Nobody moved. Open forum was usually a formality, a few complaints about road conditions, a dispute over fence lines, nothing that mattered. People shifted in their seats and looked at each other and prepared to be bored. Elena stood up. She walked toward the platform, and as she moved through the crowd, people began to recognize her. She saw it happen. The double takes, the widened eyes, the whispered consultations. The auction girl. The cross girl. The one who'd been sold and carried off by the bounty hunter. She was supposed to be gone. She was supposed to be dead, or lost, or broken. She was not supposed to be walking through the Founders' Day gathering toward the speaker's platform with her back straight and her chin up and her eyes fixed on the podium like she had every right in the world to stand there. She climbed the steps. Tom Everly stared at her with an expression of pure, unfiltered panic. "Miss Cross, I don't think—" "Citizen's business, Mr. Everly. Any citizen. That's what you said." He looked at Harlan Briggs across the square. Briggs had straightened from his lean against the post, his arms uncrossed, his face tight. He said something to Cal Stoddard, who started moving toward the platform. Elena reached the podium. 300 people looked at her. She looked back at them, at the faces she'd grown up with, the people who had watched her be sold, the community that had failed her and her father and 42 other families. And she felt something settle inside her. Not courage exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like the moment her father's hands would steady on a survey instrument, adjusting the brass fittings with infinite patience until the crosshairs aligned with the exact point on the distant horizon that he needed to see. "My name is Elena Cross," she said. 4 days ago, I was sold on a platform in this square. Today I'm standing on the same platform, and I have something to say." Cal Stoddard was pushing through the crowd toward the steps. Elena saw him and spoke faster, louder. For the past 8 years, a man named Price Calloway, operating through his partner Harlan Briggs and a network of bribed officials, has been systematically stealing land from settlers across this territory. 43 properties, 43 families, through forged documents, manufactured liens, and fraudulent surveys. A murmur went through the crowd. Not surprise, recognition. The sound of 300 people hearing out loud what they'd known in silence for years. "I know this because I have seen the records." Calloway's own records, kept in his own hand, documenting every transaction. "And I'm going to read those records to you now, every name, every date, every dollar." Stoddard reached the platform steps. Ronan materialized from the crowd and put himself between the deputy and the stairs, and the look on his face was the look that had made his name a thing people whispered. Flat, calm, absolutely certain. "Move," Stoddard said. "No." Stoddard put his hand on his holster. Ronan didn't move. He didn't draw. He just looked at Stoddard with those gray-green eyes, and something in that look made the deputy's hand stop where it was. "You draw that weapon in front of 300 witnesses," Ronan said, his voice low enough that only Stoddard could hear. "And you'll be the story everyone tells for the next 50 years. The deputy who shot a man to stop a woman from talking. Think about how that ends for you." Stoddard's hand hovered. His jaw worked. Behind him, in the crowd, people were turning, watching, and the weight of their attention was like a physical force pressing against his back. He took his hand off the holster. Elena kept talking. She named the Coltrane family, 80 acres stolen through a forged warranty deed. She named the Sung claim, mineral rights transferred through a replicated signature. She named the Dawson property, the Harper homestead, the Clearwater ranch. She named dates, she named amounts. She named the judges and clerks and filing officers who had been paid to make the thefts legal. And as she spoke, something happened in the crowd that she hadn't expected. People started standing up. Not all at once, one at a time, slowly, the way fires start. A woman near the back stood first, a thin, weathered woman in a faded dress who Elena recognized as Martha Coltrane, whose family had lost their land 6 years ago. Then a man in the middle section, old Ben Harper, leaning on a cane, his white hair bright in the sunlight. Then the Dawson brothers, side by side, their faces hard. Then others, one by one, rising from the benches and standing in the crowd, until a dozen families were on their feet, and then 2 dozen, and the standing became its own kind of testimony, a physical, visible record of damage done. Harlan Briggs watched from his porch. His face was pale, controlled, the mask held firmly in place, but his hands, gripping the porch railing, were white at the knuckles. Elena spoke for 22 minutes. She named every family, every crime, every dollar. She spoke without notes, without hesitation, without raising her voice beyond the steady, measured tone of someone presenting facts. Not accusations, not grievances, not emotional appeals, just facts, one after another, relentless and specific and impossible to dismiss. When she finished, the square was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of the auction, where people had looked away and pretended not to see. This was a different kind of silence. The silence of a room where something has broken open and everything that was hidden has spilled out into the light, and everyone present knows that nothing will ever be quite the same again. Judge Alcorn was standing at the front of the crowd, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand. He was looking at Elena with an expression she couldn't entirely read, part disbelief, part professional interest, and something else underneath both of those things that looked, if she wasn't mistaken, like respect. "Miss Cross," he said, and his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had spent 30 years presiding over courtrooms. "Those are extraordinary allegations." "They are documented allegations, Your Honor. Price Calloway maintained meticulous records of every transaction, including the original Hollister surveys from which his forgeries were derived. Those records are currently held in a compound in a location I can identify and describe. I am prepared to provide a sworn deposition detailing every entry I reviewed, and I am confident that a comparison of Calloway's records against the Territorial Filing Office will reveal systematic discrepancies consistent with the fraud I've described." Alcorn studied her for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Harlan Briggs standing on his porch across the square, and the look on the judge's face was the look of a man who has just been handed a puzzle piece he's been searching for. "Mr. Briggs," Judge Alcorn said, "I believe you and I need to have a conversation." Briggs didn't answer. He stared at Elena across the square, and for the first time since she'd known him, the mask cracked. Not dramatically. Harlan Briggs was too disciplined for drama. But she saw it in his eyes, the moment when the arithmetic finally came up wrong. The moment when a man who had spent years calculating every outcome realized he had not calculated this one. He turned and walked into his office and closed the door. Orchestrated final narrative arc, resolving all storylines with emotional depth. The door to Harlan Briggs' office stayed closed for 11 minutes. Elena counted every one of them from the platform, standing in front of 300 people who were still processing what they'd just heard, while the silence in the square thickened into something that felt almost solid. A held breath that an entire town was taking at once. Then the door opened, and Briggs came out with a rifle. He didn't raise it. He carried it loose in one hand, barrel down, the way a man carries a tool he hasn't decided to use yet, and he walked to the edge of his porch and looked at Elena across the square with an expression that had shed every trace of the patient, tolerant mask he'd worn for years. What was underneath was smaller than she'd expected. Not rage. Something more desperate than rage. The face of a man watching his own architecture collapse and understanding, for the first time, that he'd built it on ground that was never his. "You think this changes anything?" he said, and his voice was loud enough for the crowd but aimed at her. "You think standing up there and saying names makes any of it real? You're a girl with a grudge and a good memory. That's all you are." "Then you have nothing to worry about," Elena said. Briggs's grip shifted on the rifle. Cal Stoddard, still standing at the base of the platform where Ronan had stopped him, turned to look at his boss with an expression that Elena recognized. The particular anxiety of a man who has followed orders his entire life and is suddenly unsure whether the next order is going to get him killed. "Harlan," Stoddard said, "the judge is watching." "I don't care who's watching." "You should." This from Ronan, who hadn't moved from his position at the platform steps, but whose hand had shifted to rest on the butt of his pistol with the casual, practiced ease of a man for whom the gesture was as natural as breathing. "Because right now you've got a choice that's real simple. You can put that rifle down and let the law handle this, or you can raise it in front of 300 witnesses and a federal judge and spend the rest of your very short life regretting it. You don't tell me what to do in my own town, Vale. It's not your town. That's sort of the point of all this. Briggs stood there on his porch holding the rifle, and Elena could see him running the calculations one last time. The same calculations he'd been running for years, measuring cost against benefit, risk against reward, the mathematics of power that had served him so well for so long. But the numbers weren't working anymore. They couldn't work, because the equation had changed. 300 people had heard what she'd said, and you couldn't unhear something. You couldn't take it back. You couldn't bribe it, or forge it, or bury it in a shallow grave on a piece of land you'd stolen. Judge Alcorn stepped forward. He was a tall man, and he moved with the deliberate authority of someone who had spent decades commanding rooms without raising his voice. Mr. Briggs, I'm ordering you to put down that weapon. As a federal judge with jurisdiction in this territory, I am formally notifying you that you are a person of interest in an ongoing investigation into land fraud. Any action you take at this moment will be entered into the record. Briggs looked at the judge, he looked at Elena. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of the people he'd controlled and intimidated and stolen from for 8 years, people who were looking back at him now, not with fear, but with something worse. Recognition. The understanding that the man on the porch with the rifle was not powerful. He was merely armed, and there was a difference between those things that he had never bothered to learn. He put the rifle down. It clattered against the porch railing, and the sound it made was small and ordinary and final. What followed was not the clean, dramatic resolution that dime novels would have written. It was messy, complicated, slow, and full of the kind of frustrating procedural machinery that makes justice feel less like a triumph and more like a very long day at a very tedious office. Judge Alcorn commandeered the mayor's office as a temporary courtroom and spent the next 6 hours taking depositions. Elena went first, sitting in a straight-back chair across from the judge, while a clerk recorded her testimony in shorthand that could barely keep up with the density of information she was providing. She recited every entry from Calloway's ledger, all 43, complete with dates, amounts, forged document types, and the names of corrupted officials. And the clerk's hand cramped twice, and the judge went through 4 cups of coffee and at one point stopped her to say, "Miss Cross, I've been a judge for 31 years, and I have never encountered a witness with a memory like yours." "My father made sure of that," Elena said. "He always said the most important thing about a survey isn't the instrument, it's the person reading it." After Elena, the families came forward. One at a time, then in pairs, then in groups, they filed into the mayor's office and told their stories. Martha Coltrane, who'd lost her family's land 6 years ago and had been working as a washerwoman in town ever since, her hands raw and cracked from lye soap, her children growing up in a rented room above the feed store. Ben Harper, 73 years old, who'd built his homestead with lumber he'd cut himself, and watched 2 hired men ride up with a piece of paper that said the land wasn't his anymore, and there was nothing he could do about it. The Dawson brothers, who'd spent 3 years petitioning the territorial office to review their claim and received the same form letter back every time. "Your petition has been received and will be reviewed in due course." Signed by a clerk who, according to Calloway's records, was receiving $50 a month to make sure no petition was ever reviewed at all. Their stories were not dramatic. They were ordinary. They were the stories of people who had worked hard and played by the rules and believed that the system would protect them, and who had learned one by one, in the particular way that ordinary people learn such things, slowly, painfully, without anyone to explain it to them, that the system had been purchased by someone with more money and fewer scruples than they would ever have. Ronan gave his deposition last. He sat in the chair across from Judge Alcorn and spoke in the flat, unadorned style of a man providing a field report, facts, observations, conclusions, nothing extra. He described his investigation, the deaths of Ben Alcott and Margaret Sung, and the disappearance of David Park, the supply routes he'd tracked into Wren Valley, the compound he'd observed. He described the passage through the escarpment, the office, the records on the shelves, and Price Calloway standing in the doorway telling them that testimony could be discredited. "And can it?" Judge Alcorn asked. "Her testimony? I'd like to see someone try." Alcorn sent 3 federal marshals into the mountains the next morning, guided by the route Elena drew from memory. They took 15 men and a wagon, and they went in through the canyon, not through the escarpment passage, because the marshals had the legal authority and the firepower to use the front door. Calloway's guards at the canyon entrance took one look at the badges and the rifles and made the practical decision to step aside. They found the compound exactly as Elena had described it. They found the office. They found the ledgers on the shelves, every entry matching Elena's testimony with a precision that the judge later described as either the most extraordinary feat of memory I've encountered or evidence of collaboration with the subject, until he compared her deposition to the physical records and found that she'd been wrong about 3 amounts by less than $10 each out of 43 entries and right about everything else. They did not find Price Calloway. The office had been emptied of personal effects. The bed in the main building was stripped. A horse was missing from the corrals. Calloway had left sometime during the night after Elena and Ronan's visit, taking what he could carry and leaving behind everything he couldn't, including the ledgers, which were apparently too heavy and too numerous to transport on a single horse in the dark. He'd made a calculation. Elena understood the logic of it. He'd bet that she wouldn't make it back to town, that Briggs' men would intercept them, that the ledgers would remain safely in his vault, and the only risk was the contents of one young woman's memory. He'd gambled on the distance between the valley and Coulter's Bend, on the time it would take, on the likelihood that 2 exhausted people on tired horses would be caught by a search net that covered the entire Eastern Territory. He'd lost the bet. And by the time he understood he'd lost it, the only rational move was to run. The marshals searched for 3 weeks. They tracked his horse south through the Sage Flats, then west toward the Nevada border, then lost the trail in a stretch of rocky desert where the ground was too hard to hold prints. The best trackers in the territory, including, eventually, Ronan himself, followed every lead and came up empty. Price Calloway disappeared. Not dramatically, not in a blaze of gunfire or a desperate last stand. He simply rode into the desert and didn't come out the other side. Whether he made it to California or Mexico or died alone in a dry wash somewhere between the mountains and the border, nobody ever found out. It bothered Elena. She'd wanted him to face a courtroom, to sit in a chair and hear his crimes read back to him the way she'd read them to the crowd in Coulter's Bend. She'd wanted the satisfaction of watching the law work, the real law, not the corrupted version that Calloway had purchased and bent to his purposes, but the actual mechanism of justice that her father had believed in. She told Ronan this one evening, 3 weeks after the Founders' Day gathering, sitting on the porch of her father's house. Her house now, restored to her by a court order that Judge Alcorn had signed the day after the depositions. The paperwork had moved faster than anyone expected, driven by the sheer weight of evidence and the political reality that 43 families with documented grievances represented a constituency that no territorial official could afford to ignore. "It doesn't feel finished," she said. "He's out there somewhere, and the fact that he's out there means he got away with it. Not the land. He lost the land. But the other thing, the bigger thing, he never had to sit in a room and be told what he did." Ronan was sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of pine with slow, absent strokes that suggested he was doing it more for the motion than the result. His bad knee was stretched out straight, propped on a lower step, and the evening light caught the scar across his nose and the lines around his eyes. "You want a confession," he said. "I want accountability." "Those aren't always the same thing." "I know. That's what makes it hard." He turned the piece of pine in his hands, studying it with unnecessary attention. "I've been doing this for 12 years, tracking people, bringing them in. And the thing I've learned is that catching someone doesn't fix what they broke. It just stops them from breaking more. The fixing is different work. It's slower and it's messier, and most of the time nobody gives you credit for it because it doesn't look like anything from the outside." Is that supposed to be comforting? It's supposed to be honest. V. Elena looked out at her father's land, the fields he'd cleared, the fence posts he'd set, the well he'd dug by hand in the summer of 1863, hauling up bucket after bucket of dry earth until he hit water at 40 feet and shouted so loud the neighbors heard him from a quarter-mile away. The house needed work. The barn roof sagged. The fences had fallen into disrepair during the months she'd been gone, and the garden her father had kept, tomatoes, beans, squash, the practical vegetables of a practical man, had gone to weeds and volunteer grasses. It would take months to set things right. Maybe longer. And it wouldn't be the same because her father wouldn't be there to argue with her about the proper spacing of fence posts or to insist that the southeast corner of the garden got the best afternoon light, and therefore deserved the tomatoes, not the squash, because tomatoes required dedication and squash would grow anywhere. "Are you staying?" she asked Ronan. He stopped whittling. It was the first time she'd asked the question directly, though it had been sitting between them for days, the unaddressed fact that his work was technically done. The records had been recovered. The fraud had been exposed. The families were getting their land back. Catherine Farrow's case was being processed along with the other 42, and the Territorial Filing Office was conducting a complete audit of every claim Calloway had touched. "I don't stay places," he said. "That's not what I asked. It's the answer I've got." Elena let it sit. She'd learned over the weeks she'd spent with Ronan Vale that pushing him toward a direct answer was like pushing a mule toward water, technically possible but exhausting and ultimately pointless, because the mule would drink when it was ready and not a moment before. "Catherine Farrow wrote to me," she said instead. "She's coming back. Bringing the children, William and Rose. She wants to rebuild on the property." Something moved across Ronan's face, fast, there and gone, like a fish breaking the surface of a still pond. "When?" "Next month." She asked if I'd help her get settled, help her navigate the paperwork, the filing process, all the things that need to happen to reestablish a claim that was fraudulently transferred. "And you said yes." "Of course I said yes." He nodded. He went back to whittling, and the pine shavings curled off the blade and dropped to the porch floor in pale spirals. "You know," Elena said, "for a man who's very good at finding people, you're remarkably bad at letting people find you." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you've been sleeping in a camp on the ridge above my property for the last 2 weeks instead of in the spare room I offered you. It means you eat dinner at my table every night, but you leave before the dishes are done. It means you fixed my barn door and my well pump and the broken step on this porch, and you did all of it before dawn so I wouldn't see you doing it." Ronan said nothing. "It means," Elena continued, "that you're the kind of man who will ride into a town and bid $5,000 he doesn't have to save a woman he's never met, and then spend the next month trying to convince everyone, including himself, that it didn't mean anything." "It meant something." "Then act like it." The whittling stopped. Ronan sat very still on the porch steps, holding the piece of pine and the knife, and the evening light was fading and the first stars were coming out, and somewhere in the distance a coyote was beginning its nightly conversation with the darkness. "I don't know how to do this," he said, "the staying part. I know how to track and ride and shoot and sleep on the ground and go places where nobody knows my name. I don't know how to be somewhere. I don't know how to have a porch. Nobody knows how to have a porch. You just sit on it." "Elena." "Ronan." "I'm serious." "So am I. You sit on it. You watch the sun go down. You fix the step when it breaks. You eat dinner with someone and you stay for the dishes. That's all a porch is. That's all any of it is." He was quiet for a long time. The stars filled in above them, thick and bright the way they get in country where there's no light to compete with, and the wind came down from the mountains carrying the smell of pine and cold rock and the particular emptiness of high places. "The spare room," he said finally. "Does it have a window?" "East-facing. You can see the mountains." "Huh." He folded the knife and put it in his pocket. "I'll think about it." "You do that." He stayed. Not that night. That would have been too direct, too simple, too unlike the man he was. But 2 nights later, when a late-season storm blew in from the west and turned his ridge camp into a mud hole, he appeared at Elena's kitchen door with his bedroll under his arm and his hat dripping and said, "I'm thinking about it." And Elena opened the door and didn't say anything because some moments are better served by silence than by words. The territory changed. It changed the way things change when the mechanism holding them in place breaks. Not all at once, not smoothly, but in lurches and starts and painful readjustments that took months to settle into anything resembling a new normal. 43 families had their claims restored. It wasn't simple. The paperwork alone took Judge Alcorn's office 4 months, and there were disputes and complications in cases where the land had been sold to third parties who'd purchased it in good faith from Calloway's fraudulent operation and now found themselves caught between the law and their own investment. Some of those cases settled. Some went to trial. Some dragged on for years. Harlan Briggs was arrested, tried and convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder in the death of James Farrow. The trial lasted 3 weeks and produced testimony from 27 witnesses, including Elena, whose memory held up under cross-examination so thoroughly that Briggs's attorney later told a colleague it was like trying to impeach a filing cabinet. Briggs was sentenced to 18 years. He served 11 before dying in the territorial prison of Pneumonia, alone, on a February night when the temperature dropped below zero and the prison's heating system, which had been broken for 3 years and never repaired because the warden didn't consider it a priority, failed entirely. Cal Stoddard resigned his badge and left the territory. He went to Oregon, where he took a job as a farmhand on a cattle operation and spent the next 20 years doing honest, anonymous work. He never talked about Coulter's Bend. He never talked about the auction. He never talked about the moment when Ronan Vale looked at him at the bottom of the platform steps, and he'd taken his hand off his holster because he knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who has looked into his own future and seen it clearly, that drawing that weapon would have been the last meaningful decision of his life. Judge Whitfield, who had signed the forged documents that transferred Elena's family land, was removed from the bench and disbarred. Tom Everly, the dry goods merchant who had served as moderator at both the auction and the Founders' Day gathering, sold his store and moved to California. Pudge Wiley, the auctioneer, was last seen heading east on a stagecoach with 2 suitcases and a look on his face that suggested he was running from something he couldn't quite name. Catherine Farrow came back to the territory with William and Rose in the fall. Elena helped her file the paperwork to reclaim the property, and Ronan, who had been living in Elena's spare room for 2 months by then, though he still referred to it as thinking about it, rebuilt the barn that had been burned. He did it without being asked, working from dawn until his knee gave out, which usually happened around mid-afternoon. William, who was 8 by then, and serious in the way that children get when they've lost something important too young, followed Ronan around the worksite with a hammer that was too big for him and a determination that reminded Elena painfully of her father. "He wants to help," Catherine said, watching her son through the kitchen window of the temporary cabin they were living in while the house was rebuilt. "He is helping," Elena said. "Ronan just hasn't figured out how to tell him that. Ronan doesn't seem like a man who says much. He says plenty. You just have to know how to listen." Rose, who was 5 and had freckles and was still afraid of thunderstorms, adopted Elena with the immediate, unconditional certainty of a child who has decided that a person is safe. She followed Elena around the property, asked questions about everything she saw, and fell asleep one afternoon on Elena's porch, with her head on a folded blanket and her small hand wrapped around the handle of a wooden spoon she'd been using to dig in the garden. Elena watched her sleep and thought about her father, who had died on a road outside of town with his horse on top of him and a bullet in his back that the coroner had called consistent with a riding accident because the coroner was one of the names in Calloway's ledger, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not grief. Something further along the road from both of those. Something that lived in the space where anger and grief have burned themselves out and left behind only the slow, stubborn work of continuing. Her father had believed that the law would protect them. He'd been wrong, but he'd also believed something else, something he'd never said directly, because he wasn't the kind of man who made speeches, but that Elena had absorbed from years of watching him set fence posts in the heat and trace survey lines by lamplight and insist on accuracy in every measurement, every filing, every handshake. He'd believed that building something real was its own form of argument, that a fence post set straight and deep was a statement about the kind of world you wanted to live in, that a survey done right, precise, honest, without shortcuts, was worth more than any claim or deed or piece of paper, because the paper could be forged, but the measurement couldn't. The land was what it was. The distances were what they were. The water ran where it ran, and the boundaries fell where they fell, and no amount of money or corruption could move a mountain or reroute a creek. He'd been a stubborn, difficult, obsessive man, and he'd been right. The auction platform in the center of Coulter's Bend was torn down that winter. Not by official order. Nobody directed it. One morning in December, Ben Harper showed up with a pry bar and started pulling nails, and by noon 6 other people had joined him, and by evening the platform was a pile of lumber stacked neatly at the edge of the square. The lumber was later used to build a public notice board, a large, weatherproof structure where territorial announcements, court orders, land filings, and community notices were posted for anyone to read. Elena suggested it. She'd thought about it for weeks, What should replace the platform? What kind of structure should stand in the place where she'd been sold? And she'd considered and rejected a dozen ideas before arriving at the simplest one. A place where information was public, where documents were visible, where anyone could walk up and read the truth of things without needing to know the right people or pay the right price. It wasn't a monument. It wasn't a memorial. It was a notice board. And every time Elena walked past it and saw someone standing there reading a posted announcement, a land filing, a court decision, a notice of public meeting, she thought about her father's hands on Hollister's maps, tracing the lines that described the world as it actually was, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a measurement taken correctly. Ronan never formally stopped being a bounty hunter. He just stopped leaving. He took work when it came to him, tracking a horse thief, locating a missing person, helping the new sheriff with cases that required someone who could read terrain and follow a trail. But he didn't ride out looking for it anymore. He fixed things around Elena's property with the same relentless, silent competence he'd applied to tracking fugitives, and he was bad at conversation and worse at compliments, and he still sometimes slept on the ridge above the house when his knee hurt and the walls felt too close. But he was there. He was there in the mornings, and there in the evenings, and there for the dishes. And that was enough. One evening, almost a year after the auction, Elena sat on the porch and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. The fields were planted, the barn was standing. The garden had tomatoes in the southeast corner because she'd put them there without thinking about it, and realized only after they'd started growing that she'd placed them exactly where her father would have, in the spot with the best afternoon light, because some things get passed down without anyone deciding to pass them on. Ronan came out and sat on the step beside her and handed her a cup of coffee that was too strong, the way he always made it. "You ever think about what would have happened?" he asked, "if I hadn't shown up at the auction?" Elena took the coffee and held it between her hands, feeling the heat through the tin cup. "Sometimes." And then I stopped thinking about it, because it didn't happen that way. You did show up. I did get free. We did find the valley and the records, and we did stand in that square and say what needed to be said. That's what happened. The other version is just a story I didn't live. Fair enough. They sat on the porch and drank bad coffee and watched the light fade. And Elena thought about a thing her father had told her once, years ago, when she was 10 years old and furious because a neighbor's cattle had broken through their fence and trampled the garden, and her father had simply gone out the next morning and started replanting. "Why aren't you angry?" she'd asked him, and he'd looked at her with dirt on his hands and sweat on his forehead and said, "I am angry, Elena, but angry doesn't plant beans." She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now. Angry doesn't plant beans. Angry doesn't set fence posts or file claims or rebuild barns or sit on porches drinking coffee. Angry is a fire that burns hot and bright and then goes out, and when it's out, you're standing in the same place you were before, only now you're cold, and the work still needs doing. The work still needed doing. It always would. The territory wasn't fixed. It was just less broken, and less broken was the best anyone could hope for, and that had to be enough because perfection was a lie that people told themselves to avoid the harder, truer business of showing up every day and doing what they could with what they had. Elena Cross was 24 years old. She had rope scars on her wrists that had faded to thin white lines. She had a house that needed a new roof and a garden that needed weeding and a notice board in town that needed a fresh coat of paint. She had a memory full of survey lines and ledger entries and the sound of her father's voice saying the crosshairs have to align with the exact point. Elena, not close to it, not near it, the exact point. She had a man sitting beside her on the porch who was very good at finding people and very bad at everything else, and who was trying, in his slow and stubborn and deeply imperfect way, to learn how to be found. She had work to do. She finished her coffee, set the cup down, and went inside to do it.